The fog comes first, not the soft kind, but the kind that clings heavy, damp, and full of warning. Then comes the smell. Smoke from burnt bedding, charred cloth, and the copper tang of blood. London's streets lie hollow, yet alive with the restless shuffle of those who survived. Somewhere beyond the alleyways, a mother whispers prayers over her child. Another man coughs into the night, the kind of cough that echoes through empty houses. Footsteps scrape across cobblestones, followed by the rattle of carts and the quiet drip of water from ruined roofs. Survival drips through the city like poison. Each step carries the weight of yesterday's dead and the shadow of what will not leave. They said the plague was over. They said life would return, but recovery has claws, and the city remembers. Hunger waits in the alleys, whispering like a ghost that knows every loss. So tonight, dim the lamps and hear the wind through the eaves, because this is where it began. England's daily nightmare when the plague ended, and the true terror of life resumed. Subscribe and stay with me. There are more shadows to follow, more streets to wander, and more nights that never end. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The past is never as distant as it seems. The bells stopped one morning in late autumn, when the mist clung low enough to swallow the rooftops. No one knew whose hand had rung them last. For months, years, perhaps they had tolled without pause, iron throats marking every death as faithfully as the priests had once marked the hours. And then, suddenly, they were done. No echo, no farewell, just silence, so deep it pressed against the ribs like a held breath. In the narrow lanes, where bodies had once been wheeled through like fallen timber, the absence of sound felt wrong. People stood in their doorways, not daring to speak, listening for what wasn't there. Even the crows had gone. The air smelled of lime wash and smoke, the scent of cleansing fire that had become England's new perfume. London was still damp from the endless washings, walls scrubbed white with vinegar, floors salted with ashes, prayers whispered into rafters blackened by the breath of the dying. The city looked clean, but it was the kind of cleanliness that felt scraped raw, like skin after fever. Those who survived moved like sleepwalkers. They blinked at the sunlight as if it were some strange new thing. When the carts stopped rolling, they still expected them. Phantom wheels grinding through the mud, phantom cries of "bring out your dead" that sometimes slipped through dreams into daylight. The living kept their distance from one another, not out of law anymore, but habit. Years of fear had hardened into ritual. The step aside, the turned face, the way hands refused to meet. On Cheapside, a baker opened his shutters for the first time in months. Inside, the air was thick with dust instead of flour. The old smell of yeast, the smell of life, had vanished. When he lit the oven, the smoke rose straight into the low fog, curling like incense from a tomb. Across the lane, a tailor stitched by the window, his needle trembling as if it remembered the shrouds. He hummed under his breath, a soundless tune, just to fill the air with something human. They said the plague was over. The death pits had been sealed with lime, the fires burned out, the rats fewer than before. But no one truly believed in endings anymore. The sickness had taught them that life was only ever an interval between losses, and in that interval, the city must pretend to live. A priest passed by the churchyard and paused beneath the tower. Moss had begun to climb the stones. He touched the bell rope that hung like a vine, its fibers stiff with soot and weather. For a moment, he seemed ready to pull it again, to summon the sound that had carried so many souls beyond the living world. But his hand fell away. The silence was sacred. Now, to break it would be to invite memory back into the streets. Night came early that evening. The mist thickened, swallowing windows and lamps, until only a faint red glow marked where life still flickered. Somewhere, a child coughed. Somewhere else, a door closed too quickly. And in that hush between movements, the city itself seemed to listen to the drip of rain, to the slow exhale of the river, to the emptiness that followed survival. For the first time in years, London slept without the bells. But the silence they left behind was not peace. It was waiting. They tried everything: vinegar, ash, rosemary, even the church's incense burned in every window until the smoke made eyes water and lungs ache. Still, it lingered. The smell, it clung to wood, to wool, to every hand that had ever drawn a curtain over a corpse. It was not the smell of rot anymore, not exactly. It was the memory of it, faint, sour, almost sweet, the scent of things that had died trying to become clean. When dawn broke, the air hung heavy with it. Every house that had been scrubbed until the plaster cracked still breathed decay through its walls. The floorboards wept it when rain fell. Even the river, swollen and grey, carried the perfume of the plague downstream, past the bridges, through the heart of London, into the marshes where no one dared to live anymore. They said time would wash it away, that after enough winters, the city would smell of bread again, of horses and hearth smoke, of life. But the years that followed felt like a slow bleaching of the soul. The odor was no longer death's announcement. It was its signature. In the shambles, butchers returned to their trade, cutting fresh meat where bones had once piled high. The knives gleamed, but the gutters still remembered. Stray dogs gathered, nosing the stones, whining softly as though they could smell ghosts the way they once smelled blood. Housewives bought meat with their faces turned aside. They had learned to breathe through their sleeves. At night, when the wind shifted, the scent changed too. It came sharp and metallic, the tang of lime and rain over earth newly turned. In those moments, even the bravest men paused mid-step. They said it was the wind from the plague pits the city's breath, rising again from under its own skin. Workers who dug new foundations sometimes struck bone. They'd curse, cross themselves, and keep digging. What else was there to do? London needed walls, not memories, yet the smell found its way inside everything, into the bread ovens, into the hay, into the letters sealed with wax. People began to believe it had become part of them, that their sweat, their clothes, even their breath carried the faint trace of the dead. Mothers whispered to their children, "Don't inhale too deep," as if scent alone could wake what had been buried. By the firelight, old women told stories, how the smell was the plague's last promise, how it lingered to count the living. "It waits," one said, stirring her broth until the steam curled upward like a hand. "It waits until we forget." But forgetting was impossible. The city's own walls betrayed them, sweating the smell from the mortar when fog rolled in. Carpenters swore they could taste it in the sawdust. Priests claimed it haunted the chalice. And in the grand houses of the surviving wealthy, perfume merchants thrived, mixing oils to hide what could not be erased. Lavender, rosewater, amber, each masking, never cleansing. Sometimes, in the small hours, when the streets fell still and the moonlight crept through unshuttered glass, the odor grew stronger again, as though rising from the stones themselves. It slipped into rooms, into dreams, into lungs. People would wake choking, not from sickness but from memory. They would strike a candle, see nothing, and lie back, trembling, the ghost gone but the scent still there. So they learned to live with it, to hang herbs over their doors, to keep windows open even in the cold, to burn vinegar in bowls beside their beds. And yet every dawn, the smell returned, soft and steady as a heartbeat. The plague had gone, but its breath remained invisible, unending, and too familiar to fear. At first, no one dared to walk them. The lanes of London lay bare, slick with old rain and soot, every cobblestone shining like bone beneath the weak light. The air was still, too still, as though the city itself had stopped breathing when the bells fell silent. Only the wind moved long, shallow gusts that carried the echo of distant doors slamming, as if the dead still came and went by habit. For a time, even the rats kept to the shadows. There were too few scraps now, too few bodies. The silence had driven them deeper underground, and it unnerved the living more than the squeals ever had. Silence meant memory. Silence meant listening, and everyone had something to listen for. The children came first. They were the ones who could not remember enough to be afraid. Barefoot and hollow-eyed, They darted through the alleyways like ghosts of another kind, playing games in the places where corpses had once lain stacked by the dozens. Their laughter was brittle, almost painful. The adults watched from windows, afraid to stop them, afraid to join them. It was easier to let the noise return through small voices than none at all. Then came the sellers, slow at first, then bolder. A woman with onions hung from a rope across her shoulders. A man pushing a barrow of pewter cups, each dented and pitted with old use. Every item looked second-hand because everything was. Nothing in the city was new anymore. Only re-inhabited clothes, beds, homes, even hope. One morning, the sound of hooves returned. A rider moved down the high street, not at a gallop but a measured pace, testing the air. His cloak trailed dust. People peered from doorways but didn't wave. No one trusted anyone who traveled freely. The sickness might have ended, but the mind of it had not. Suspicion was the city's new contagion, spreading with every glance that lingered too long. By winter, the fog had come back thicker than before. It rolled through the streets as if to fill the emptiness left by the dead, curling around every lamppost and doorway. At night, it swallowed the glow of the few surviving taverns, turning them into floating islands of light in a grey sea. Those who ventured out after dark walked quickly, breath steaming, eyes averted from the places where shadows pooled. The city's stray dogs learned new habits. They slept beside chimneys for warmth, scavenged the scraps from bakeries that dared reopen, and barked at nothing visible. People began to say they were barking at ghosts. It was easier to believe that than to admit they were barking at silence. The Thames ran sluggish, rimmed with frost and refuse. Its surface reflected no stars. Along its banks stood the plague pits, fenced now and sealed over, yet still forbidden to approach. Even years later, no one built near them. They said the ground sighed sometimes, that it shifted at night. Whether it was the frost or something older beneath, no one stayed long enough to find out. And so, the city lived, half empty, half alive. The markets reopened, the prayers resumed, but the streets between them remained hollow corridors, lined with memory and mildew. The living moved like tenants in a house too large for them, their footsteps small, their voices careful, their eyes fixed always on the ground. On Sundays, the churches filled again, though the bells still did not ring. The priests said it was to honor the lost, to give peace to the survivors. But the truth was simpler. No one dared wake what silence had buried. The plague was gone, they said. Yet as dusk fell and the fog crept higher, the city's emptiness spoke louder than any sermon. You could almost hear the echoes, faint, rhythmic, almost human. The sound of footsteps that weren't there, keeping pace with the living, reminding them that survival and loneliness were now the same thing. He still wakes before dawn, though there are no bodies left to bury. Habit is a stubborn thing, forged deeper than faith. For years, the church bells were his summons, their mournful clang his only clock. Now the silence wakes him instead, that strange, weightless hour before light when the city forgets what it has survived. Thomas of St. Bride's was not a young man when the plague came. He'd buried through 3 summers and 2 winters, digging until his palms split and healed again in calloused layers. He'd long stopped counting how many he laid beneath the earth. Sometimes he remembers faces, but only in fragments: a braid of hair, a hand still clutching rosary beads, a boy's boot with the sole half gone. The rest blur into the dirt. He used to have a rhythm for it. 2 feet deep in the morning, 4 by noon, 6 by dusk. Then start again. He'd eat standing up, bread gone hard with dust, then work through the night by the light of burning pitch. The dead didn't keep hours. Neither could he. When the plague broke the graveyards open, Thomas and the others dug beyond the walls, in fields so full of corpses the soil itself turned grey. Now he sits beside the same churchyard, his shovel leaning against the stone. The grass has grown back, though unevenly. The earth still sinks here and there, betraying where the ground never settled. Children run past, chasing each other, their laughter thin and fragile. He cannot bear the sound. It reminds him too much of what came after: laughter, the coughing, the quiet, the cart. He tried to take other work when the dying stopped. A builder needed men to help raise new homes on the old plague fields. Thomas lasted a week. The smell of turned soil made him ill. He said it was the dust, though everyone knew what kind of dust it really was. Sometimes he dreams that he's still digging. The shovel strikes something soft, then something hollow. He wakes with his fingers twitching, trying to grip the handle that isn't there. In daylight, he walks to the edge of the churchyard and stares at the ground, half expecting it to breathe again. People pass him now without nodding. To them, he's a relic of the sickness, a reminder of how close death once lived among them. When he goes to the tavern, conversation falters. They call him Earthman behind his back. He's stopped minding. The earth is the only thing that ever listened. Once, a boy from the parish asked him how deep he had to dig to bury the plague. Thomas looked down at his hands, the cracks, the thick scars, the black beneath his nails that never washed out, and said, "Deeper than man can reach." The truth was simpler. You cannot bury something that lives in the air, in the stone, in the silence after bells. You cannot bury a memory that has learned to breathe. When he leaves at dusk, the setting sun strikes the gravestones, lighting them like rows of small fires. The air smells faintly of lime and wet clay. He runs his thumb along the edge of his spade and feels the old callus rise beneath the skin. Somewhere, a raven caws and flutters down to perch atop a mound that never quite settled. Thomas tips his hat to it. "Evening," he murmurs. The bird tilts its head as if to listen. He smiles then, the first time in months, and for a moment the world seems quiet enough to forgive him. But when night falls and the fog returns to lay its cold hand upon the city, the old gravedigger lies awake again. Beneath his window, the ground shifts just slightly, just once. He tells himself it's the frost, but his fingers ache the way they did in the days of death, and somewhere deep inside him, the shovel moves. They walked the streets long after the sickness was gone, wrapped in their worn black cloaks and masks that once terrified children. The city still gave them a wide berth, as if the beaked silhouettes might somehow summon the plague back from memory. But these were no longer physicians, only remnants of the war between death and denial. When the plague had raged, they were the nearest thing London had to soldiers. Armed with vinegar-soaked rags and theories half borrowed from monks, half stolen from rumour, they had entered houses others dared not look upon. They had written their notes by candlelight, their pens scratching over trembling paper as screams echoed from the rooms above. They had believed, once, that knowledge might hold back the tide. Now their books gathered dust. The ink had faded, the diagrams of humours and phlegm yellowed with time. No one wanted to read about air that kills, or cures that failed, and yet some of them couldn't stop. Each evening, as fog crept in, the healers gathered in cold chambers to talk of what they'd seen, as if naming the horror might keep it from returning. Dr. Elias Harford was one of them. Once a man of standing, now he lived in a rented attic above a candlemaker's shop in Fleet Street. He hadn't worn his mask in 2 years, but its shape haunted the corner of his vision like an old sin. His patients had stopped coming long ago. There were no fees left to collect, and no trust left to earn. Instead, he wrote long letters to no one, filling his pages with the stories of those he could not save. The mother who burned her child's cradle to drive out the air, the priest who begged for confession and died mid-prayer, the midwife who refused to stop tending others until she fell herself. He wrote until the ink ran thin, then sat and listened to the city below, its new noises born from industry rather than agony. He missed the quiet of the plague, though he hated himself for it. There had been a strange order in death, a rhythm he could measure, diagnose, record. Now, life returned in chaos. Men drank louder, women laughed sharper, carts clattered through the lanes with new greed in their wheels. The world had moved on, but the healers had not. Sometimes, Elias met with his few surviving colleagues at the apothecary's cellar near St. Paul's. They spoke in low tones over candlelight. One had taken to alchemy, trying to turn ash into medicine. Another swore the cure had been in the rats all along. They debated until dawn, voices hoarse, eyes wild, each trying to invent meaning for what had devoured them. Above them, the city healed in ways they couldn't. Shops reopened. Children were born. The market cried again, but in the shadows where the healers walked, there lingered another kind of sickness, a quiet one that came from knowing too much. Elias began carrying a small pouch of herbs again, not for protection, but for scent. Lavender, myrrh, sage, the same mix. He had stuffed into the beak of his mask. He burned it at night to cover the ghosts. The smoke drifted through the cracks in his ceiling, curling like grey fingers toward the stars. The people called them healers of ash. Now those who had touched too many corpses, breathed too much fire, seen too much proof that mercy and death were often the same thing. No one thanked them. No one remembered them kindly. But when the air turned cold and the bells stayed silent, they were the only ones who still listened for coughing in the dark. They never heard it again, but they never stopped listening. The first loaves came out black, burned, hard, and bitter, like the months that birthed them. London's ovens had stood cold for too long, doors sealed with wax, ashes swept around with lime, each one a tomb where a baker had once breathed. When the city began to stir again, people gathered near those same hearths, as if the smell of bread could mean safety. But when the smoke rose, it carried the wrong scent. Marjorie Whitlow was the first to light her oven on Fleet Lane. She had lost her husband, her 2 sons, and her apprentice all within the same week. For months, the little shop had been silent, its shelves bare, its windows nailed shut. When she finally pried them open, the wood splintered like bone. She found the dough trough dry and cracked, her old wooden peel warped by time. The air inside smelled faintly of vinegar and ghosts. Still, she kneaded. Her hands shook, but she worked as though kneading could bring back rhythm to the world. The neighbors watched through the window, whispering that the plague clung to flour, that death hid in yeast. But when the scent of baking reached the streets, smoky, imperfect, but alive, people came closer. They wanted proof that the city could feed itself again. Marjorie sold her first loaf for a penny, then broke down crying when she realized no one had the strength to eat it. Teeth had loosened during the sickness. Stomachs had forgotten fullness. Bread, once the measure of life, had become a stranger's gift. Across the city, other ovens followed. The Guild of Bakers, what was left of it, gathered to reclaim their trade. They spoke softly in the flower-dusted halls of St. Mary le Bow, counting names of the dead before each meeting. There were too few of them now. Apprentices had vanished. Masters had no heirs. Every loaf that came from their hands was both sustenance and monument. But bread was no longer simple. Wheat had grown wild in the fields outside London, untended, yellowed, and coarse. The harvest, after the plague, was thin. The price, cruel. Only the rich could afford fine white flour, leaving the poor to grind what barley and acorns they could find. The loaves turned grey, heavy, and sour, yet people lined up for them anyway, clutching their coins as if warmth itself could be bought. In the markets, the cries of bread sellers returned, hoarse, cracked, unfamiliar. Hot loaves, fresh baked, echoed through streets that had forgotten their hunger. Mothers tore crumbs to feed their children, their fingers trembling, and in every bite there was the taste of lime, of smoke, of graves too near to the roots of the wheat. Some nights, when the wind changed, the scent of baking still turned sour halfway through the lane. People would pause mid-step, noses lifted, hearts quickening, as if expecting to see a cart rumbling past again. But it was only the ovens breathing the same smoke that once carried prayers, now carrying the promise of survival. Marjorie kept baking until her hair turned white. She never remarried, never left her shop. Each morning, she lit the fire, whispering to the silence, "For those who cannot," and the city, piece by piece, began to remember what warmth smelled like. But even as the loaves grew softer, sweeter, lighter, the old taste never left. Beneath every crust lingered a faint bitterness, like the echo of ash. London was alive again, yes, but it would never be clean. By spring, the markets returned. Not the grand, noisy ones of the old days, thick with merchants shouting over one another, but small gatherings, quiet and cautious, as if the air might still bite. Women came first, their faces veiled in soot-colored cloth, baskets hooked to their elbows. They spread blankets over the cobbles and laid out what the dead had left behind. It was not food they sold, but memory. Silver spoons tarnished by disuse, wool coats cut down to fit smaller bodies, candlesticks bent and blackened by too much prayer. Every object came with its own silence, a price paid twice, once by the dead and once by whoever dared to touch it. Margaret Fenn, who had buried her husband and 2 sons before midsummer, sold shoes. She sat by the gate of St. Dunstan's, the soles stacked like gravestones beside her, the smell of leather mixed with the faint perfume of old decay. She no longer haggled. The price was whatever people could offer, sometimes a farthing, sometimes bread, sometimes a look that said, "I remember you from before." The widow's market grew out of that grief. Day by day, more women came. The ones left behind, they brought ribbons, pots, handkerchiefs, even locks of hair sealed in jars of oil. These were not merchants, they were survivors, learning how to live by selling the ghosts of others. The sound of the market was unlike any London had known. No shouting, no laughter, only the soft murmur of exchange, the whisper of fabric passing from one hand to another, the clink of coins, the hush of shared sorrow. Men came too, eventually, drawn by need or hunger. They stood apart, uneasy among the rows of veils. To buy here was to admit loss. To walk through the widow's market was to confess survival. The city's clergy disapproved, calling it unholy to profit from the belongings of the dead. But even priests needed candles, and more than one was seen bargaining quietly at dusk. The plague had blurred every line between sin and necessity. Some women began to craft new things from the remnants. Shrouds became tablecloths. Rosaries were broken down and restrung as necklaces. A kind of artistry was born there, rough, desperate, but beautiful in its defiance. What had once been tools of mourning became tokens of endurance. Margaret learned to stitch. She took strips from the lining of her husband's old coat and turned them into purses. One day, a young girl bought one, pressed it to her chest, and said, "It smells like home." Margaret didn't know whether to laugh or weep. By summer's end, the market stretched from one end of the square to the other. Smoke from street fires curled above it, mingling with the scent of tallow and rain. Children darted between the stalls, snatching crumbs and ribbons. Life, in its quiet way, had found a foothold again. Yet beneath the chatter and the shuffle of feet, there was always that undercurrent of absence. Every sale was a funeral in disguise. Every coin passed carried the weight of a name unspoken. At night, when the torches guttered and the stalls were folded away, the square would fall silent again. A few scraps would remain, a glove, a button, a dropped spoon shining faintly in the moonlight like offerings left for the lost. The next morning, the widows would return, open their baskets, and begin again, not to forget, but to endure. For in the widow's market, the dead still paid the rent for the living, and the living learned, one trade at a time, how to stop dying. They were easy to spot, even years later. The lime-washed crosses had faded from their doors, but the wood beneath still bore their outline, ghostly X's that no rain could wash away. They stood on the edges of lanes, windows shuttered, roofs sagging under mildew and time. The neighbors walked past quickly, heads bowed, voices lowered, as though sound alone could wake what slept inside. The city called them plague houses. Once, they had been sealed with wax and law, marked with warning words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." No one had crossed their thresholds without reason or desperation. Now, they stood hollow, the final witnesses to the silence that had killed half a kingdom. Inside, the air was still thick with the memory of breath. The floors bowed where stretchers had scraped them raw. In some, the walls were scratched lines made by the fevered hands of those locked away and forgotten. People said that when the wind was right, the doors moaned open of their own accord, but few stayed long enough to see if it was true. Thomas, the old gravedigger, said the city should have burned them. The healers said fire was too merciful. And the landlords, greedy even for haunted ground, said the walls could be mended. So, they were mended poorly, quickly, by men who worked with their collars up and their eyes down. The new tenants were never told the truth. They were the desperate ones, migrants, widows, laborers who could not afford fear. They filled the rooms with candles, herbs, and prayer, trying to drown the past in scent and sound. But at night, the air turned heavy again. The candle flames trembled, as if the walls were breathing. In one such house on Bishopsgate, a young couple moved in with their newborn son. The rent was cheap, the hearth still sound. For the first few weeks, they said it felt blessed, quiet, sheltered, untouched by the noise of the recovering city. But then came the scratching, soft at first, like mice. Then, louder, as if fingernails were clawing, the plaster from the inside. The husband tore up the floorboards one morning and found nothing, only a rosary, pressed into the dirt, its beads blackened as though burned. He buried it in the yard and said nothing to his wife. But by the next night, the child would not stop crying. They left before the next moon rose. When the landlord came to collect his rent, he found the cradle overturned and the candle stub melted into the shape of a hand. He sold the house again within the week. Every street had one, sometimes two places no one wanted, yet always occupied by someone with nowhere else to go. Children whispered stories about them, daring each other to knock on the doors after dusk. The brave ones swore they heard coughing from inside. The rest just ran. By law, the plague houses should have been cleansed, blessed, or pulled down. But laws in England were like prayers spoken often, seldom kept. The city needed space for the living, and the living needed to pretend the past was over. So they kept building around them, new bricks beside old walls, new laughter above old graves, and under it all, the air still hummed faintly of vinegar and sorrow. Sometimes, on mist-heavy nights, when the fog crept low across the cobblestones, people would swear they saw faint light behind those shuttered windows. Not firelight, but something colder, pale, flickering, like breath caught between worlds. And though no one admitted it, everyone knew. London's dead had never truly left. They had only changed address. They were the last generation born before the silence. The children who learned to speak in whispers, who played beside plague pits, and thought the smell of lime was what the world was supposed to be. Their first memories were not of lullabies or lessons, but of muffled sobbing behind locked doors and mothers burning clothes in the yard. By the time the bells fell silent, they were the ones left to listen. They grew up fast, because there was no childhood left to inherit. Their games were strange things played in alleys where weeds broke through the cobbles, among the ruins of houses that no one dared reclaim. They played death cart instead of kings, taking turns to lie still while the others dragged them by the ankles, chanting the old rhymes the adults had banned. "Bring out your dead," they whispered, laughing too loudly, too nervously, because laughter was the only sound that didn't echo with loss. The mothers scolded them, not out of cruelty but fear. "Mustn't mock it," they said, crossing themselves at every giggle. "Death has ears." But children are bolder than faith. They mimicked the plague doctors with bird masks made of paper, stuffed with herbs stolen from church gardens. They built coffins out of crates and carried their dolls to burial behind the wells. They didn't understand why it frightened the grown. To them, death was not horror, it was history, the ghost that tucked them in at night. And yet, the nightmares came. They dreamed of scratching under floorboards, of footsteps on stairs that ended nowhere. Some woke crying, insisting they had heard their mothers calling from the old plague houses. Others went silent altogether, staring at the sky for hours, as if waiting for smoke to rise again. The city called them the memory-born. Teachers found it hard to reach them. When the parish schools reopened, the children struggled to learn prayers or letters. Their hands shook when asked to write their names. They preferred to draw instead rows of graves, little stick figures holding torches, suns that looked more like eyes. A visiting scribe once called their sketches the art of the haunted. The phrase stayed. As they grew older, the strangeness deepened. Some became candle makers, unable to forget the smell of melted wax. Others turned to medicine, trying to name the thing that had taken everything from them. Many simply vanished into the city's growing slums, half adults, half shadows, carrying their silence like inheritance. At dusk, you could see them by the old churchyards, sitting on the walls, tossing pebbles into the grass below. They didn't speak, just listened to the creak of the earth, the hiss of fog over stone. When asked what they heard, one boy said simply, "The ground, remembering." By then, London had begun to forget. The markets grew louder, the taverns fuller, the bells rang again for weddings instead of funerals. But the children did not cheer. They watched the city rebuild and understood something no one else would admit, that survival was not healing and noise was not life. Years later, when another sickness swept through the lanes, it was those same children now grown who recognized the sound of the first cough. They knew how quickly laughter turned to prayer, how fast streets could empty, how deep silence could go. They were the ones who closed the shutters first, the ones who carried lime before the city asked, the ones who remembered what forgetting cost. And though they never said it aloud, every time the air thickened, every time the wind changed, they waited for the bells to start again. They came out of hiding when the air grew still again. Their robes were faded, their faces hollowed by fasting and fear. Once, priests had been shepherds, guiding their flocks through the bright pasture of faith. Now, they were wanderers in a field of graves, clutching their worn Bibles like relics from a vanished world. When the plague was at its worst, most of the clergy had fled. A few stayed, burning candles until the wax ran out, praying over bodies until their own throats burned. Some survived. Most did not. Those who returned found their churches changed. The pews were gone, broken up for firewood during the long winter of death. The walls sweated lime. The air inside smelled of mold and forgotten incense. And the altars, those sacred stones that had once heard the murmured confessions of kings and beggars alike, were now marked with the ash of too many absolutions. Father Edmund was one of the first to reclaim his parish near Cornhill. He had buried so many that he could no longer lift the shovel himself. His hands trembled even when they were empty. When he stepped into the ruined church, the echo of his footsteps startled him. The silence was so complete that it felt like blasphemy. He rang the bell once that first morning. The sound rolled through the city, slow and uncertain, like a question no one wished to answer. No one came. There were no parishioners left, only shadows moving behind windows, faces watching from door cracks. For weeks, Father Edmund said Mass to empty pews. His voice wavered but did not falter. He sang hymns into the cold air, his words swallowed by the hollow acoustics of survival. On Sundays, he placed bread and wine upon the altar, though no one came forward to receive them. The Eucharist was for ghosts now. Slowly, others followed his example. Priests reappeared across London, gaunt figures drifting through streets that no longer trusted them. Some were greeted with relief, others with scorn. The people whispered that it had been the priests who brought the sickness through their blessings, their holy water, their visits to the dying. Faith had survived, but it had changed its face. The old prayers no longer sounded right. "Deliver us from evil," the people murmured, but they had seen evil and knew it by scent and touch. "Thy will be done," they said, and their voices cracked. The plague had taught them that God's will was unknowable and perhaps unbearable. Father Edmund kept preaching anyway. He took to walking the streets at dusk, his lantern swaying beside him, offering last rites to no one in particular. Children followed him sometimes, laughing nervously, pretending to faint when he passed. To them, he was part of the city's new folklore, a reminder of the time when men in robes came to close your eyes. He began writing sermons he would never give. His script was small and delicate, each word pressed carefully into the page as though it might bleed. In one, he wrote, "We prayed for mercy." But mercy never came. It stayed at the door, afraid of infection. By winter, his church had begun to fill again, not with worshippers, but with the weary, the widowed, the homeless, the ones who still smelled faintly of vinegar and earth. They came to rest, not to pray. Father Edmund let them. He no longer spoke of salvation. He spoke instead of endurance. Sometimes, when the fog rose through the open windows, he imagined he could hear his old congregation singing again, their voices soft, far away, like a tide returning. He would close his eyes and join them, just for a verse, before the sound dissolved back into silence. By the time the next spring came, the priests of London had learned a quieter kind of faith. They no longer promised heaven. They simply promised presence, a hand at a bedside, a voice in the dark. And for a city that had learned to live without both, that was miracle enough. The sickness had taken half the country, but it was the survivors who learned how truly poor England could become. When the last carts rolled away and the churchyards began to level with grass again, the world that remained was quieter, but it was also crueler. The lords still had their land, though their tenants were bones beneath it. The priests still had their tithes, though no flocks came to pay. But the peasants, the labourers, the small folk who had once bowed their heads and ploughed the fields, they had nothing left to fear. And that frightened the powerful more than any plague ever had. The countryside had gone wild. Whole villages stood empty. Thatched roofs caved in, wells grown green with moss. Sheep wandered through open gates, untended, their wool hanging in matted clumps like forgotten offerings. Wheat ripened where no one came to reap it, bending under the wind until it rotted back into the soil. The few who remained discovered something strange without masters. The land gave freely. For the first time in living memory, there were more fields than there were hands to work them. Those who survived could name their price, and they did. "Double the wage," said one ploughman. "Or I walk." "Triple," said a shepherd. "For the sheep know me better than they know you." The lords bristled, their seals and titles suddenly worth less than a loaf of coarse bread. In London, merchants cursed the same truth. Porters, smiths, washerwomen, all demanded coin, and silver they had once touched only in their dreams now gleamed between their fingers. It was a new order, an accidental kingdom born from catastrophe, and though the rich swore it was unnatural, the poor called it justice, but the crown called it treason. In the year after the plague's retreat, the king's scribes gathered in Westminster, their quills scratching faster than they had in years. They wrote new laws, harsh and swift. No man was to leave his master's service. No woman was to refuse her lord's wage. All who survived, they declared, shall labour as before, and be content with their station. They called it the Statute of Labourers. The ink dried darker than blood. Word of it spread faster than fever. In taverns and barns, men spoke in low voices. They called the law a chain, forged by cowards who'd hidden while others buried the dead. In the fields, overseers rode with whips to remind them what obedience was supposed to feel like. The lashes sang louder than sermons. Still, defiance simmered. A mason named Hugh left his manor without leave and found work 2 shires over for twice the pay. A widow named Alice set up her own stall in the market, selling bread baked from stolen grain. "What law governs the dead?" she asked when questioned. "None, and I was as good as dead myself. For every life the plague had taken, it had loosened a chain somewhere. Men who had once bowed to bishops now cursed their names. Women who had buried husbands began keeping the keys to their homes. And so, from the bones of pestilence rose something the kingdom feared most of all, hope without permission. By winter, the lords began gathering soldiers again. They no longer marched against disease or invaders. They marched against the living, against the workers who had survived too well. The plague had ended, yes, but the sickness that followed the one born of power, hunger, and law would spread deeper and last longer. For the first time, England's poor had learned the taste of worth, and nothing, not even a king's decree, could make them forget it. At first, no one noticed. The markets reopened with the smell of yeast and rain, and people thought the worst was over. The air still carried whispers of ash, but life had found its footing again. Then the cost of flour doubled, then tripled. Then even the wealthy began to count their coins before lighting candles. London had survived the plague, but money had caught the fever next. Where once a single penny could feed a family, now it barely bought a crumb. The plague had thinned the people, not their hunger. There were fewer hands to sew, fewer carts to carry grain, fewer bakers to fill the ovens. And yet, the rich still demanded their bread white, their ale strong, their feasts full. They could afford to forget. The poor could not. In the narrow lanes of Suffolk, women gathered at dawn to bargain with the grain merchants. They stood in lines that stretched past the wells, clutching handfuls of coin that lost value with every sunrise. The merchants, those who had survived, had grown fatter. They spoke softly, smiling through their teeth, knowing the city's bellies were held in their hands. When the women begged, they shrugged. "There is less wheat," they said. "The dead do not sow." And so the living starved in a city of empty houses. The lords called it divine order. They told the peasants that scarcity was the price of sin, that God had spared them not for comfort but for humility. Yet their storehouses told a different story. Barrels of grain lined their manors, guarded by men with pikes. Even the church, once the city's refuge, demanded coin for mercy. A candle before a saint now cost a meal. A burial cost a week's wages. The poor buried their own in silence, whispering prayers into the soil. The city council issued decrees to steady the market, but the words were wind. The more they wrote, the more the prices climbed. Money had become another sickness, one that crept into every home, feeding on fear and greed. The coiners smelted, new pennies, thinner, lighter, a deception so obvious it fooled no one. People began to barter again, bread for cloth, eggs for nails, prayer for protection. In the markets, fights broke out daily. Mothers clawed for stale loaves. Bakers were accused of hoarding flour and had their windows smashed. At night, gangs of hungry men prowled the lanes, their faces wrapped in rags. They knocked at shop doors, whispering, "Charity or fire." Yet even in ruin, commerce found its rhythm. Money flowed toward those who could bend others to need. A merchant who once sold candles began trading shrouds instead. A silversmith melted crosses into spoons. Everyone became something else. Survivors turned scavengers. Piety turned to profit. In a small shop near Ludgate, a widow named Anne sold bread made from ground peas and sawdust. It was bitter and grey, but it filled the stomach for a while. "It keeps the hunger quiet," she said to each buyer, her voice steady, her eyes hollow. People came from across the city for her loaves. No one asked what else she mixed into the dough. By winter's end, the new economy had found its balance. Hunger at the bottom, plenty at the top. The price of life itself had risen. And though the plague had ended, its arithmetic remained. The fewer the living, the dearer their labor, the costlier their breath. England had survived death, only to be devoured by debt. They had watched the world unravel from their manors, those high, timbered keeps where the wind never smelled of the dead. The plague had thinned their tenants and starved their fields, but it had also left something intoxicating in its wake. Fear. And fear, to men who owned the land, was another kind of harvest. At first, they played the part of grief. They rode through their estates with their heads bowed, counting empty cottages, murmuring prayers for the souls they'd once taxed. But when the candles guttered out and the mourners stopped wailing, the truth settled in like dust. The dead could not pay. The survivors would have to pay twice. Across England, Heralds rode with new decrees. Rents were raised to fill the coffers that had drained during the sickness. The crown itself demanded tribute from lords who had already lost half their income, and so they turned upon the living with sharpened pens. Old debts were unearthed like bones, interest compounded like rot. In Wiltshire, a farmer named Stephen Hodge refused to pay his doubled rent. "The land's worth less now," he told his lord, "and so is my back." The steward laughed and took his plough instead. When Stephen struck him, the punishment came swift and public. They dragged him to the stocks in the market square, his wrists raw from the rope, but the crowd that gathered did not jeer, they watched in silence, the kind of silence that meant remembering. For every Stephen, there were dozens who bent the knee. Hunger made easy servants of proud men. Families signed new oaths, binding themselves for generations to soil they would never own. The landlords called it stability. The peasants called it another plague. In London, the pattern repeated in finer clothes. Whole streets of tenements changed hands while their tenants still mourned. A widow who'd buried her husband in the spring returned from the fields to find her home sold in autumn. "The lease expired with his breath," said the collector. She left without a word, her children trailing behind like shadows. Even the church took its share. Priors and bishops who had preached mercy now brokered land deeds with the precision of merchants. Monastic fields swelled as common ones shrank. The Lord's work, they called it. And indeed it was the work of keeping power breathing, even when faith had gone cold. But the lords had forgotten something. The poor had changed. The survivors no longer feared authority as they once had death. They had seen kings bleed, priests rot, and graves gape where power once stood. A new boldness simmered beneath the submission, a quiet, deliberate kind that waited for the right wind. By candlelight, in barns and taverns, men began to speak of fairness, of wages, of worth. They whispered of a day when no man would kneel for soil he'd already fed with his own dead. The landlords tightened their grip, raising rents higher, sending sheriffs to collect with the threat of gallows behind them. But the tighter the hand, the more the grain slipped through its fingers. By the end of that year, England's wealthiest men slept behind bolted doors, dreaming not of gold, but of fire. Because in every village, every parish, every field newly taxed into despair, there was the faint smell of smoke whispering what the wind already knew. You can't own land that remembers its dead. They left at night, always at night. Small groups, at first 3 or 4 labourers with their wives, and what they could carry slung across their backs. Then families, then whole clusters of cottages emptying at once. By dawn, smoke rose from abandoned hearths, and the landlord's men would ride through, cursing the silence left behind. The fields glimmered with dew and neglect. The furrows lay half-ploughed, half-forgiven. No one announced it. There were no banners or oaths, just a slow, steady exodus from the open earth toward the promise of something else. Freedom, rumour, a different kind of hunger. The plague had torn up the old roots, and the survivors were learning how to walk again. In the villages of Kent, men whispered that higher wages waited in the north. In Essex, they said London's merchants would pay a silver penny for every day's work. In truth, no one knew, but hope travels faster than law, and the law was slow, written in ink that hadn't dried since before the sickness. So they walked. Farmers became wanderers, their calloused feet treading roads once haunted by the death carts. Mothers carried infants, wrapped in shawls, stiff with soot. Old men leaned on walking sticks, muttering prayers to the saints who hadn't saved them. When they passed through towns, people stared half pity, half envy, for the travellers carried with them the one thing rarer than bread: choice. The landlords called them deserters. The king's sheriffs called them thieves. Every man owes his labour to his liege, they said, chasing them down the rutted lanes. But the roads belonged to no one. The open country was a new kingdom, ruled only by distance and will. On the ridge roads near Canterbury, the fields gave way to the sight of the city, its spires rising through the fog like broken teeth, the smell of tallow, of iron, of smoke, of life so thick it made the newcomers dizzy. They entered London through the same gates that had once been sealed against plague, their eyes wide with disbelief. For those who had buried neighbours and tilled over graves, the city was a promise that refused to die. But London was no mercy. It had its own lords, its own tolls, its own hunger. The streets swallowed them as easily as the plague had once swallowed their kin. Families slept beneath bridges, their hands blistered from labour by day and numb from cold by night. They carried tools instead of titles, dreams instead of coin, yet even in misery, there was something defiant in them, a refusal to bow again to the same soil that had betrayed them. Back in the countryside, the fields waited. Sheep wandered through rows of untended grain. The manor stewards posted edicts on doors that no one would ever read. All labourers who flee shall be branded and fined. But branding requires capture, and capture requires hands enough to hold the rope. A few were caught. Dragged back in chains, they were made examples of whipped, fined, or worse. Yet the stories of punishment did little to stop the flow. For every man returned, 2 more slipped away the next night. The roads themselves became veins of change, pulsing with movement. From village to village, word spread. There's work in Winchester. There's bread in York. There's freedom in walking. And so they walked, mile after mile, wearing down the distance between the old England and the one still being born. By the time the king's men realized how many had gone, half the fields of southern England lay fallow. The harvest rotted in the soil, and the wind carried the smell of loss, not of death this time, but of abandonment. The land had been master once. Now it waited, hollow and hungry, for the footsteps that would never return. It was written in the summer heat, when the air above Westminster hung thick with the scent of parchment, sweat, and fear. The plague had receded, but its shadow lingered too wide, too deep, too human to bury. England's rulers sat beneath the carved beams of the great hall, their silks clinging damp to their necks, their voices rising like flies above rot. They spoke not of the dead, but of the living, the ones who had learned to ask for more. The king was young, barely past boyhood, his face pale beneath the crown. Around him, old men whispered of order and rebellion, of servants who demanded coin instead of loyalty, of farmers who dared to walk away from their fields. "The kingdom will starve," one lord said, "unless we chain the living before they forget they were ever slaves." The king nodded. The scribes began to write. Thus came the Statute of Labourers, sealed with red wax still warm from the royal hand. Its words were clear as iron and just as cold. No man shall refuse work at the wage he earned before the pestilence. No servant shall leave his master without leave. No labourer shall demand increase of payment or threaten to depart. It was law now, law against hunger, law against hope. The ink had barely dried when the sheriffs took to the roads. They read the decree aloud in marketplaces, their voices echoing against the stone. Peasants stood listening, hats in their hands, their eyes dull and sunburnt. They understood every word, but no one spoke. The silence was not obedience, it was memory. In the fields near Ely, a group of ploughmen laughed after hearing it read. "Let the king come plough it himself," said one, spitting into the earth. That night, soldiers came to his cottage. His body was found by dawn, face down in the mud, the statute nailed to his door. Word spread like dry grass catching flame. In taverns, the men cursed softly. In churches, priests whispered the new law between sermons about obedience. But even as the decree was spoken, it was breaking. Workers fled under moonlight, changing names, swapping parishes. Lords offered bribes in secret to poach labourers from one another, while pretending loyalty to the king's edict. The whole of England became a theatre of hypocrisy, every man for himself, every coin a rebellion. In London, the statute took another shape. Masters posted guards at their workshops. Bakers locked apprentices inside to prevent them from leaving. Weavers were forbidden to sell their cloth without license. A woman who once earned a penny a day for washing linens was hauled before a magistrate for asking too. She left with her hands bleeding from the lash and her eyes burning with something sharper than shame. And yet, the law could not still the pulse of the new age. The plague had carved a truth too deep for parchment to smother. The living were no longer afraid to lose what they had already lost. By winter, the edict hung on every church door, curling with damp. Rats gnawed at the corners. The words that had promised control were fading, the ink running like spilled blood. In the villages, people read them and smiled bitterly. They knew that laws written by the comfortable are never meant to be kept by the starving. So they turned away from the notices, back to their work, their wandering, their quiet defiance. The statute of laborers would live on in the king's records, but in the hearts of those who dug, baked, stitched, and buried, another law had already taken root, one written not in ink, but in survival. The dead had been obedient, they said. The living no longer would be. It began, as all storms do, with whispers. Not banners or swords, just words murmured over ale, over ploughs, over the tired crackle of hearth fire, the kind of words that slip between men who have nothing left to lose. "If the king eats from our labour," said one farmer near St. Albans, "then let him come reap his own bread." The others laughed softly, but not from mirth. The laugh was a shield, a sound to make the words feel less dangerous. By now, the statute of labourers was known in every shire, nailed to church doors and recited by stewards who couldn't read half the words. It was supposed to chain the workers back to the fields, to silence the asking, the bargaining, the walking away. But the chains were invisible, and invisible chains are the easiest to break. In the taverns, the ale tasted sharper. Men leaned closer when they drank, their voices low, their faces lit by candlelight and defiance. They spoke of coin owed and land stolen, of priests who grew fat while the peasants' children gnawed bark from trees. A mason from Kent said he'd seen a bishop's storehouse filled with wheat that had never touched a starving mouth. "They preach mercy," he muttered, "but mercy has a price." The women whispered too. In the churchyards, while hanging laundry to dry, they'd seen their sons taken by sheriffs for asking honest pay, their husbands beaten for leaving a field they no longer owned. "We buried our dead without a priest," one woman said, "and the sky didn't fall. Maybe we don't need their blessings anymore." The others nodded, quietly, always quietly. By midsummer, a restlessness spread through the countryside like a fever, slow, sweating, and unstoppable. Men who had once walked alone now travelled in groups. Tools became weapons in waiting, sickle blades sharpened not for harvest but for reckoning. No one said the word revolt, not yet, but the thought hung heavy in the air, as ripe as the wheat. The lords pretended not to notice. They still rode through their estates with their retainers, cloaked in silk, their boots clean of mud, but their smiles were thinner now, and their guards carried more steel. They sensed it, the change beneath the soil. The peasants no longer bowed as low, the women no longer stepped aside when they passed. A friar named John Ball began to preach again, though he had been exiled for it once before. He spoke not in Latin, but in the plain tongue of the people. When Adam delved and Eve span, he cried, "Who was then the gentleman?" The crowds that gathered to hear him didn't cheer. They listened. Stillness can be louder than shouting when the right words are spoken. In the evenings, when the fog rolled down the hills and the last embers died in the hearth, fathers told their sons about the days before the plague, how they had been bound to lords, bent to masters, and how the sickness had burned the world clean of certainty. The old world died with the dead, they said. What grows next is ours to shape. No one called it rebellion yet, because rebellion was a death sentence. They called it something else. Fairness, justice, wages, words soft enough to pass as prayer. But the wind carried them farther than the speakers knew, through the hedgerows, over the bridges, into the ears of men who had never dared hope before. And somewhere in the heart of England, the silence broke. A steward's barn burned one night, then another. The lords called it mischief, called it sin, called it the devil's work. They didn't call it what it truly was, the first breath of a people remembering they were alive. By the time the fields greened again, the city's apothecaries were busier than they had been during the plague itself. Only now, the sickness they treated could not be named. The people called it the heaviness, or the waking fever, a trembling of the hands, a pounding in the skull, a dread that came with dawn and left with the dark. The priests said it was guilt. The physicians said it was the air. The poor said it was the cost of surviving. Whatever it was, it made the healers rich. Along Fleet Street, the old plague doctors' shops had turned into apothecaries. The masks were gone, but the fear remained, bottled now in glass. Shelves gleamed with tinctures and powders, new promises for an old despair. Laudanum, opium, powdered pearls, and mercury. The same hands that once burned incense for the dying now sold relief to the living. Each vial came with a price, and every price was higher than the last. Dr. Elias Harford, the healer of Ash, had returned to his trade, though not to his faith in it. He no longer spoke of cures. He spoke of calm, of forgetfulness, of rest. His clients came at night, merchants who twitched in their sleep, widows who still smelled the ghosts of vinegar and lime, young girls who could not stop washing their hands. They left his shop dazed, eyes glassy with gratitude, and something else, addiction in its first disguise. The city was learning a new kind of sickness, one that soothed while it consumed. A drop of laudanum for the nerves, a sip of poppy syrup for the dreams. It dulled the nightmares, yes, but it also dulled everything else. The people said it was a blessing. Elias said it was a leash. He wasn't wrong. The lords bought it by the bottle, the poor by the drop. In the workhouses, children were given doses to quiet them through the long hours of spinning and weaving. In the taverns, men stirred it into ale to forget the sting of hunger. By winter, every street had its own scent, the mix of smoke, sweat, and sweet rot from the drug that bound London tighter than the plague ever had. Still, the city called it healing. The church blessed it. The crown taxed it. Even the doctors wrote new names for it, masking poison in Latin. For melancholy, they said. For nerves. For the common fatigue of the soul. Elias began to see the faces return, the same hollow eyes, the same desperate voices, though now they came dressed in finery. More of the tincture, doctor, they'd say, pressing silver into his palm. Just enough to sleep through the noise. But the noise they feared was not outside. It was within the echo of prayers unanswered, the hum of guilt that no medicine could silence. One evening, as snow fell over the city, Elias closed his shutters and poured the last of his laudanum into the fire. The flame hissed blue and died down, leaving only the smell of burned sweetness behind. In the silence that followed, he heard it again, the coughing from the alley, faint and ragged, the same sound that had haunted him since the plague. Only now it came not from the dying, but from the living who had learned to mistake numbness for mercy. And as the snow thickened on the windowsill, he realized the truth England had been running from since the bells stopped tolling. The plague had ended. Yes, but the sickness of forgetting had only just begun. They sang for bread before they ever sang for God. In the courtyards of London's half-ruined churches, children gathered at dusk, thin, hollow-eyed things with voices too pure for the streets that raised them. Some had been found on doorsteps wrapped in plague sheets. Others had no memory of parents at all. The city called them the foundlings, as though the word itself was an act of charity. They were taken in by the monasteries, washed, fed, and trained to sing. It was said that their hymns could lift the grief from a man's chest, though only for as long as the notes lasted. At St. Bride's, Father Edmund had made a habit of leaving the church doors open during practice. Passers-by would pause at the threshold, listening to those fragile voices rising through the dust. No gold chalice or relic drew as many pilgrims as the sound of those children singing Miserere mei, Deus, have mercy upon me, O God. The words clung to the cold stones, trembling like candlelight. They sang because they were told to, But they sang also because silence frightened them. Silence, to a plague-born child, meant absence of food, of touch, of life. Their songs filled the emptiness left by years of quarantine and quick burials. Each note was an exorcism of loneliness. The city loved them for it. Patrons came bearing coins, claiming salvation through generosity. The bishops smiled, for every donation fattened the church's coffers. But behind the cloister walls, mercy was rationed like bread. The orphans slept in rows on straw mats, their ribs visible beneath thin linen. When one fell ill, the others sang louder to drown the coughing. Father Edmund called it faith. They called it survival. One boy, Thomas, a name he had given himself because no one else had, was the smallest and the loudest. His voice rose clear above the rest, sharp enough to make the priests weep and the parish ladies clutch their hearts. But when he sang, his eyes stayed open, fixed on something, unseen above the altar. He claimed he could still hear the bells that once tolled for the dead, faint but steady, even when the wind was still. The others teased him at first, then they began to hear them too. Some nights, the older children would wake to find Thomas kneeling by the door, humming the low, steady tone of the bell. "They're calling," he would whisper, "for the ones we forgot." By spring, the choir's fame had spread. Nobles invited them to perform in their manors, to bring a hint of holiness into halls that smelled of wine and fear. The orphans sang as they were told, their voices echoing against tapestries depicting saints who had never touched the London mud. Afterward, they were given bread, sometimes meat, always a coin that never reached their hands. One night, as the choir returned from Westminster, their cart broke a wheel on the bridge. They waited in the cold while the monks cursed and fetched a smith. And from the river below, through the fog, they heard it again, a faint, rhythmic tolling, so deep it seemed to come from beneath the water. Thomas smiled first. "They're still singing," he said, his breath fogging the air, "the ones below." When morning came, the sound was gone. But in the church, Father Edmund found the boys already at prayer, their voices weaving through the rafters, soft and strange. He stood listening for a long time, unsure whether it was hope or haunting. For the rest of that year, London said the orphans sang like angels, but those who had lived through the plague knew better. They sang like the dead who had learned to breathe again. He was always there at the southern end of London Bridge, leaning on the parapet, muttering to the river. The traders who passed called him Old John of the Water, though no one knew if that was his name or merely a warning. His beard hung to his chest, grey and matted, his coat a patchwork of stolen cloth and memory. Children tossed him crusts for luck. Sailors crossed themselves when he laughed, for he laughed at nothing, nothing visible. Anyway, they said he had once been a scholar, or a clerk, or a bell ringer from St. Olave's. Others said he was a gravedigger who had buried too many to count. No one asked him to confirm it. No one wanted to hear the answer. He had the look of a man who remembered too much. Each morning he arrived before the fog lifted, whispering into the wind that rolled off the Thames. "It's still here," he would say, tapping the stone with a finger blackened by dirt. Still breathing underneath. Passers-by hurried past him, the sound of his properly, voice like a draft beneath a closed door. But if you lingered, if you let the hum of the city fall away, you could hear it. The slow rhythm of his words, matching the tide's pulse. "Up and down," he'd murmur. "Up and down, just like lungs." Once, a baker's apprentice stopped to listen. The old man pointed to the water, his eyes wide with certainty. "They're still there, boy. All of them. The ones they pushed in when the carts were too full. The river remembers." The boy spat into the water and said, "Then let it choke on them," before walking away. John laughed so hard he coughed blood. By noon, the bridge was alive with noise, fishmongers shouting, carts creaking, bells clanging from the churches beyond. The madman's voice was drowned, but he didn't mind. He seemed to be waiting for the quiet to return. He never begged, never slept in the same place twice. Some nights, they said, he walked the riverbanks, searching for faces in the current. Others swore They saw him kneeling beside the water at low tide, tracing crosses in the mud. Once, when Father Edmund crossed the bridge on his way to St. Bride's, the madman caught his sleeve. "You should bless the water," he said. "You blessed the land, but not the water. That's where it hides now." The priest pulled free, but the words followed him for days. The next Sunday, he looked down into the font before Mass and thought he saw something moving there, something small and pale, like a fingertip brushing the surface. The city's watchman tried to drive John away more than once. He always returned. "The bridge keeps me," he'd say. "It was built on bones." And though they mocked him, no one doubted that part. The plague pits had spread so wide that even the foundations of the city sat on the dead. In the winter of the Great Frost, when the Thames froze solid enough for markets to be held on its surface, John vanished. For weeks, people walked across the ice, where he had once stood, laughing, skating, trading goods over the frozen river that had swallowed so many. Then one morning, when the thaw began, a child found a bundle snagged against the bridge piling. It was a coat patched, frayed, and heavy with silt. Inside the lining, stitched in uneven thread, was a scrap of parchment. "It's not the sickness that kills," it read. "It's the forgetting." They buried him in a pauper's grave, unblessed, but even after that, people swore they could still hear him on foggy nights, his laughter drifting over the river, rising and falling with the tide, like lungs still breathing beneath the water's skin. It began as a habit, a small, invisible instinct. Hands that once clasped in greeting now hovered mid-air, uncertain. Neighbors who had once embraced at weddings or wakes learned to nod instead, careful, distant. The plague had burned its lesson deep into the flesh, that kindness could kill and love could be contagious. Even years after the sickness had passed, no one truly touched, not without flinching, not without fear. In the narrow lanes where the sun never reached, people brushed shoulders and whispered apologies as if they had sinned. Mothers lifted their children with cloth between them. Lovers met behind shutters and kept a breath's distance, even in the dark. The physicians called it nervous contagion. The priests called it punishment. But to the people, it was simpler. Memory living under the skin. In Cheapside, a cloth seller named Agnes kept a bowl of vinegar by her stool. Every coin passed to her went into the liquid before entering her purse. She did not remember when she started doing it, only that her mother had taught her, and her mother before that, until the act felt older than her own name. One day, a soldier came to buy a length of linen for a burial shroud. When he reached to hand her payment directly, their fingers brushed. She recoiled so sharply that he dropped the coin. It rolled into the gutter. He laughed, but the sound had an edge. "The dead don't bite, mistress," he said. She didn't answer. In taverns, men drank from their own cups, each guarding his ale, as if it contained his soul. The shared pitcher, once a mark of friendship, vanished. So did the handshake, the old symbol of trust. Even trade changed. Goods were exchanged with tongs, money left on doorsteps, blessings given with hands raised but never laid. And yet, the absence of touch made the longing sharper. At night, people dreamed of it. The press of a palm, the warmth of another's skin, the weight of an arm around the shoulders. Dreams that left them weeping quietly upon waking. Father Edmund saw it in his congregation. His flock filled the church again, but the pews were spaced apart, their bodies as separate as their prayers. During communion, he offered the wafer from a silver spoon rather than by hand. The first time he did it, an old woman wept. "Even God won't touch us now," she said. Outside the city, in the fields where new laborers bent to the soil, men wore gloves of oiled cloth, though no sickness lingered. The habit had become a creed. "The earth took enough," they said. "Let it not take more through our hands." In London's hospitals, nurses wore scarves over their mouths. They tended to the wounded, the fevered, the broken but never skin to skin. One nurse, a girl barely 17, confessed to a friend that she no longer remembered what warmth felt like. "It's like we're all ghosts," she whispered, "alive but untouching. Sometimes, in the alleyways at dusk, you could see it, the panic, hesitation of one person reaching for another, then stopping mid-motion. The pull of instinct colliding with the weight of memory. A decade after the plague's end, the fear still lived quietly, passed down like inheritance. Children grew up watching their parents flinch and learned to do the same. But once in a while, something broke through: a mother lifting her child without gloves, a widow taking another's hand in prayer. Moments small and trembling, but real. The city was learning, slowly, painfully, that healing was not just about surviving the sickness. It was about daring to be touched again. And somewhere beneath the fear, in the pulse of every hand that almost reached, the old human hunger for closeness waited, patient as the plague, but far more merciful. The dead had left the city silent, but the living filled it with noise again. And this time the sound carried the tang of profit. Merchants returned with ships from the continent, sails full of goods and rumors alike. Silk from Italy, spices from Alexandria, coarse cloth from Flanders. London's docks swelled with trade, and with it a new order rose, one that no king, no lord, and certainly no priest could fully control. John Peveril, a shipwright by trade, stood at the wharf one morning, watching crates unloaded from a vessel bound for Bristol. The wood smelled of salt and cedar, the ropes frayed from long voyages. He had survived the plague, and in that survival he had discovered something. The tides of commerce cared little for the bodies that had gone before. A man could make more from a single shipment than he had in a lifetime of tilling soil, and the same man could lose it all if he misjudged the wind or the buyer's greed. The new merchants were sharper, faster, and colder than the old gentry. They had watched London burn and the countryside empty, and they had learned that survival demanded adaptability. They underbid each other, hoarded ships, bribed harbour officials, and whispered deals in alleys where no law could reach. They became lords in everything but name, their power measured in coin and influence rather than bloodlines. At market, the change was tangible. A loaf of bread could now cost a farthing more if the merchant had paid well for wheat shipped from the south. Ale flowed in taverns only for those who could pay. The rest stood outside, shivering in the winter wind. The plague had thinned the population, but it had also thinned patience. Everyone wanted what remained, and the new lords of trade controlled the supply. Women took their place too. Widows who had buried husbands now ran stalls on Cheapside, importing small goods themselves: pins, ribbons, herbs. They learned to haggle like the men, their voices low and firm. Some even borrowed ships, hiring crews to bring their merchandise from the Thames all the way to Calais. London watched them with suspicion and awe. In a city that had feared the dead, the living now feared ambition. And everywhere, coin passed hands faster than words. Every transaction was a lesson in survival: a loaf for a day's work, a bolt of cloth for a week's labor, a promise of mercy for a bottle of wine. Those who controlled trade controlled the rhythm of the city. They could make a man's week unbearable or bearable with a single decision, and they were not shy of using it. Even the king began to notice. He sent messengers, demanding tariffs and fees, but the merchants were nimble. They found loopholes in law as if born with them, shifting ships and goods to avoid the crown. The city's wealth grew, but it grew unevenly. The streets of the rich glimmered with candlelight and fresh timber, while the alleys of the poor were left with mud and frost. And yet, the city survived. The new lords of trade had done what the plague could not. They rebuilt London not with stones, but with ambition. They filled its warehouses, repopulated its markets, and set a pace that the old ways could no longer follow. The bridges echoed not with funerals, but with carts creaking under crates of goods, sailors calling across ropes, and children chasing one another through the dust. But beneath it all, in the shadows of the docks and the alleys between warehouses, the memory of absence lingered. The streets remembered every body carried away, every house left empty, every coin lost to a family too small to survive. The new lords could trade and bargain and build, but they could not trade away what had been learned. For every piece of cloth sold, every barrel of wine poured, every coin collected, London remembered that the city had once been silent, and that memory hummed beneath the bustle like the faint pulse of a heart that had refused to die. They came first at night, in the quiet hours when the lamps sputtered and the fog rolled low over the cobbles. London had survived the plague, yet the city smelled wrong. Smoke from hearths mixed with the faint, sour tang of unwashed stone, and beneath it all was the rustle of fur and teeth. The rats had not left, they had only learned to hide, to wait, to claim the darkness as their own. The rat-catchers walked the streets like shadowed kings, small, wiry men with nets and sticks. They knew every alley, every drain, every ruined cellar where the vermin nested. They were a new kind of authority, called not by law but by desperation. Households that once ignored vermin now paid handsomely for silence. "Catch them or starve," the landlords said. The merchants whispered it. Even the churches complained of the rats gnawing at the foundations. Thomas Bray, one of the most skilled of the rat-catchers, carried a leather pouch of poisoned grain. He knew the smell of London like the back of his calloused hand. A rat could hide in a floorboard for months, only to return in force when the humans were weary, the candles guttered, and the hunger in their bellies made the air thicker. His work required patience, and patience was rarer than coin these days. Children often followed him, wide-eyed, hoping to glimpse the creatures that had carried death through the city. Bray allowed it sometimes, though he warned them not to speak. A whisper could scare the rats back into hiding, and with the rats came the threat of sickness. Once, a boy tripped on a loose cobblestone, shouting as he fell. The rats scattered, and the next day, a merchant's wife fell ill with fever. The lesson spread quickly. The rats were more dangerous than any plague doctor. Bray's skill became legend. He could rid a cellar of vermin in a single night, leaving only the faint stench of poison behind. He knew which homes required traps, and which required smoke, which required the sharp snap of a net, and which required nothing but quiet observation. His fame brought coin, and coin brought respect, but also enemies. Other men claimed his methods were witchcraft. One tried to sabotage his traps, leaving poisoned grain in the wrong places. Bray found the culprit at dawn, hiding behind a barrel, and chased him into the mud, laughing in a way that made even the rats still pause. By winter, the rat-catchers were as essential to the city as bakers or millers. No hearth was safe without them, no cellar could be trusted, and yet, for all their skill, the rats returned. They were patient, adaptive, the only creatures who seemed to remember London as it had been the city of death, the city of loss. In the crowded alleys, the rats moved like shadows among the shadows of survivors. Children watched from doorways, marveling at their persistence. Merchants cursed and bribed. Landlords sent guards to chase them from storehouses. But the creatures always returned, gnawing at timber, feasting on scraps, and multiplying in the quiet, waiting for the night when they might carry disease again. And through it all, the rat-catchers walked. They became a strange kind of folk hero, the invisible line between life and decay. They carried lanterns, nets, poison, and knowledge. In a city learning again to breathe, they reminded everyone that the plague might have ended, but its echoes were alive, sharp, furry, and quick, moving under the feet of the living, unseen yet impossible to ignore. By the end of the season, every Londoner understood a simple truth. The rats were a part of the city now. They were survivors, like everyone else, and the rat-catchers were the only ones brave enough to fight the memory of death with hands and wits alone. Smoke curled upward from the scorched stones, still damp with winter frost, and the bells hung silent in the belfries as masons and carpenters began their work. The city had survived the plague, but London's churches were a testament to the dead, a skeleton of arches, broken windows, and walls streaked with ash. Every brick laid now was an attempt to reclaim what had been stolen, not just by disease, but by neglect, fear, and the merciless passage of time. Father Edmund supervised the reconstruction of St. Bride's, leaning on a splintered beam as he surveyed the half-finished walls. The stone was rough, quarried from the hills outside the city, yet even the best materials could not hide the scars of the years. Lime, sand, and sweat mixed beneath the mason's hands. The mortar set slowly, like the city itself, reluctant to forgive, reluctant to forget. The workers were survivors themselves, many of them orphaned, their parents lost to fever, their siblings gone to graves too, numerous to count. They measured their toil not in wages, but in the rhythm of survival. In the distance they could move a block of stone before the day ended. The church became a machine of memory, every beam a reminder that the living were still responsible for the dead, and that to rebuild was to hold them accountable. Windows were fitted with glass salvaged from the ruins of other houses, some broken, some cracked, their colors uneven. Light shone through in jagged patterns, painting the floor with fragments of rainbow that seemed both holy and haunted. When the first rays of dawn touched these panes, Father Edmund knelt at the altar and murmured a prayer not for the dead, not for himself, but for the city, that the living might endure. Inside, the pews were carved anew, though some bore scratches and initials of children who had survived, leaving marks of their existence behind. Every chair, every lectern, every candle holder spoke of a city learning again to remember how to live. Even the crucifix above the altar seemed different somehow, its face softer, as though it too had suffered and returned. But rebuilding the church was more than stone and wood. It was a rebirth of ritual. Priests taught the orphans to read the psalms, to sing hymns, to hold candles without fear. The sound of their voices drifted up to the rafters, mingling with the dust motes, carrying the faint echo of laughter and sobs from years past. Worshippers returned slowly, their hands shaking as they touched the doors, the pews, the holy water fonts. Touch had become dangerous again, yet they reached, tentative and trembling, as if feeling the weight of their own survival. Outside, the city noticed. The rebuilt church became a landmark of resilience, a place where the dead and the living overlapped. Bells, though not yet hung, promised the return of sound, a rhythm for the living to follow. Markets and workshops opened nearby, their din softened by the knowledge that above them, sacred space had been reclaimed from ruin. But even in triumph, the memory of absence lingered. The church's foundation sat atop centuries of burial pits, some still unmarked. Children playing outside would occasionally stumble over stones not yet settled, and the air sometimes smelled faintly of lime and ash. The priests whispered that it was the past, reminding them of its presence, and so the church rose, half sanctuary, half monument, a place where life returned cautiously. It was a beacon for the faithful, a refuge for the lost, and a quiet testament that London, though scarred, could still reach upward. Even after the plague had ended, the city needed a place to kneel, a place to pray, a place to remember, and in rebuilding St. Bride's, it remembered itself, even as the churches rose from rubble and the markets filled again. The city carried a scent that no candle, incense, or prayer could cleanse. London's floors, beneath polished boards and new tiles, hid secrets that no builder dared acknowledge. Ash, everywhere ash, the powdery residue of mass graves, burnt bodies, lime, and sorrow pressed into the very timbers of the city. You could walk across the streets and smell it faintly, feel it underfoot, though no one spoke of it aloud. In the workshops of Cheapside, apprentices sifted dust from flour and hemp, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. They were the generation that had survived both sickness and hunger, yet each inhalation reminded them of what had been left behind. One boy paused, rubbing his sleeve across his nose, and muttered that the floor smelled like the dead remembered. His master struck the table in frustration. "Mind your words," he barked. The city is alive again. But the boy knew better. The city was alive. Yes, but it was breathing through a lung half made of ash. Homes rebuilt after the plague often seemed cheerful from the street. Painted doors, newly thatched roofs, curtains fluttering in the breeze. But step inside, and the smell lingered. The ash had a weight that even the most careful cleaning could not lift. Families lit fires to chase away the chill, but the smoke only stirred the scent deeper, like dust turning to memory. Mothers washed children over and over, rubbing their skin until it reddened, yet the smell stayed, clinging to hair, clothing, and breath. In some houses, the ash had blended with the floorboards themselves. Tiny particles worked their way into cracks and knots in the wood. The boards creaked in the quiet, as though whispering stories to those who listened closely enough. Children were warned not to dig at them, not to lift the planks to see what lay beneath. The dead rest there, the adults said. Leave them. But curiosity has always been human, and small fingers sometimes strayed. They found splinters blackened and brittle, bits of lime scattered in patterns that could have been geometric or random, and always smelled of earth, fire, and fear. Even the masons who rebuilt St. Bride's and the surrounding churches knew. They told themselves it was just dust, just residue from fires or mortar, but their hands, blackened after labor, often carried a faint tang of lime and ash that could not be washed away. At night, in their chambers, they could almost hear it shifting under the floor, tiny whispers, or perhaps the wind, or perhaps memory itself. Some tried to cover it with carpets, rugs, thick layers of sand or chalk. Others lit fires, hoping the smoke would mask it. But the ash has a stubbornness born of history. It lingers, settles, and returns with each breath of wind or footstep. It is patient, like grief itself. And yet, life went on. People cooked, children played, merchants sold their wares. The city learned to live above it, over it, as if the ash were only an inconvenient foundation. But it was never gone. You could smell it faintly on a damp day, taste it in the air after a rain. It clung to the city like a secret, a memory pressed into every home, every street, every corridor. London rebuilt itself from stone, timber, and courage. But beneath the floorboards, the ash waited, patient, persistent, the past breathing quietly beneath the steps of the living, reminding them that survival carries a cost, and that the plague's shadow, though hidden, never truly leaves. It began with a cough, a single, weak sound, barely audible above the clamor of London's recovering streets. People dismissed it at first. Winter was harsh that year, and colds were common, lingering like smoke from a poorly tended fire. But then the cough multiplied, moving from one household to another, spreading silently like a shadow across the city's narrow lanes. Those who had survived the plague recognized it immediately, the rhythm, the rasp, the way it seemed to claw at the chest before letting go. Panic returned slowly, quietly, like a tide rising beneath the city. Families shuttered their windows, barricading doors with whatever boards they could find. Children were kept indoors, their small bodies trembling with fear they did not understand. Even the markets, once full of laughter and negotiation, grew hushed. Merchants no longer called loudly across the square. They whispered prices in cautious tones, glancing at every passer-by, as though the air itself might carry contagion. Father Edmund, now older, moved among the sick with the same weary determination he had carried during the first plague. He blessed the weak with trembling hands, whispered prayers for their souls, and sprinkled holy water over floors where children had played just days before. He had grown accustomed to grief, but this new outbreak brought a fresh, gnawing dread. It was not the dead returning, it was the past insisting on being remembered, showing the living that survival was never permanent. Physicians tried what they could, vials of tincture, cups of bitter decoction, poultices pressed against the fevered skin. But the remedies that had once carried weight now seemed hollow. The disease was cunning, moving silently, striking the strongest and weakest alike. Families watched helplessly as loved ones grew pale, broke into sweat, or fell unconscious, the faint rattle in their throats echoing the memory of the carts that once carried the dying away. The city began to change, again, subtly at first, then with undeniable force. Streets emptied, tradesmen closed shops and retreated to the safety of upper floors. Taverns shuttered their doors. Even the lords, who had rebuilt their manors and claimed authority over the poor, began to order gates locked and guards posted. Fear, long buried beneath recovery and commerce, returned with a vengeance. Children, orphaned and alone, became the unwitting carriers of memory. They shivered in dark corners, whispering names they had only ever heard in passing. Mothers who had survived the first wave prayed that their children would not inherit the same fate, but the disease was impartial. It did not care for wealth, station, or devotion. It moved quietly, a reminder that the city was always fragile, that life could never fully outrun death. In the marketplaces, people whispered of fleeing, as they had years before. They spoke in hushed tones of fields untouched, of villages empty, of roads that might offer escape. And some did leave, carrying what they could, running from the ghosts of a city that had already claimed so much. Yet even as the fever took hold, life continued. Those who remained adapted, layering caution over necessity. Hands were washed, doors were barred, herbs burned at windows, candles flickered in the misty dusk, illuminating faces drawn with worry but alive, still defiant in their survival. London had survived once, but the fever's return reminded everyone that survival was only temporary. The plague had ended, yes, but its lessons lingered etched into the air, the stones, the hearts of the living. And as the coughs multiplied, as the streets emptied once more, the city remembered. History does not forgive, and death is never far behind. The city breathed differently at night. Even years after the last death cart had rattled through the streets, even after the churches had been rebuilt and the markets thrummed with cautious life, there was a sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum that carried through the alleys. It was not wind, nor the shuffle of boots on stone. It was something older, quieter, and infinitely more unsettling. The memory of pestilence itself, woven into the fabric of the city like smoke in a chimney. People spoke of it only in whispers. Mothers told children not to linger in the street after dark, saying the plague walked again among them, though no eyes could see it. Shopkeepers locked doors early, muttering prayers under their breath as if words could hold back what could not be named. Even the priests, those who had survived by tending to the dying and burying the lost, walked with a careful step, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting a shadow to detach from the walls. Thomas Bray, the rat-catcher, knew the truth better than most. He had seen the city empty in the days when fever ran unchecked through its streets. He had smelled the smoke of mass graves and heard the whispering of those who would not live to speak their own names. And now, as he prowled the alleys at night, checking traps and tallying vermin, he could sense it again, the pulse of pestilence lingering in the stones, in the timber, in the very air. The rats carried it in their fur, yes, but so did the city itself. The ghost of the sickness was subtle. It did not strike like the fever had, nor march like the carts that bore the dead. It moved in flickers of shadow, in draughts that seemed to come from nowhere, in the sudden chill that travelled across a bare shoulder. People would pause mid-step, glance around, and feel a presence that was neither human nor animal, yet undeniably there. Some swore it whispered, though no lips moved, carrying a faint, sour tang of ash and lime. In the narrow lanes behind, St. Mary le Bow, a widow named Alice, found herself frozen one evening. She had gone to fetch water from the well, bucket swinging from her arm, when a draught passed through the street and carried the faintest cough. It was not human, too ragged, too intermittent, but it made her knees buckle. She dropped the bucket, water spilling over cobbles, and fled back to her house, locking doors and windows, muttering prayers for protection she no longer fully believed in. The city adapted in quiet ways. Windows were shuttered, herbs hung from doorways, small fires burned in pots to chase shadows away. Children were kept indoors, taught to fear not the dark, but what the dark might remember. Families avoided one another, maintaining distance even when it was no longer law, simply because instinct and memory had taught them that closeness could bring danger. Yet, the ghost was patient. It waited in the cracks of the city, beneath the floorboards, in the walls, in the air that carried faint whispers of coughs past. Those who lived in London learned to hear it, to feel it, to respect it. They understood that survival was not only about avoiding sickness, it was about carrying memory and living with it, day after day. Even the priests acknowledged it quietly in their prayers, admitting that pestilence had become a part of London, a teacher without form, and the city, in turn, lived around it. Markets reopened, streets filled with life, and yet the ghost remained a subtle, ever-present reminder that the plague may have ended, but its shadow never truly left. In every draught, in every gust that slipped down the alleys, the ghost of pestilence whispered, "Remember, do not forget." And London remembered. Smoke curled from chimneys across London, carrying with it the faint scent of wax and soot, mingling with the ever-present tang of ash that clung to the city like memory. The plague had ended, yes, but darkness remained a constant companion. Nights stretched longer now, as if the city itself lingered in grief, and light became the most precious commodity of all. Candle makers, once simple tradesmen, had become the unseen lifeblood of survival. Without their flickering flames, the streets would be swallowed by shadows, the homes consumed by silence, and the living would have no small measure of comfort against the weight of the past. Elspeth Wren, whose family had kept a small shop near Paternoster Row, knew this better than most. She had inherited the trade after her father had succumbed to the fever, leaving her to care for her younger siblings and her mother, who could no longer see clearly. She began her mornings at dawn, kneeling over vats of melted tallow, stirring the molten mixture with a long wooden paddle until it ran like liquid gold. She worked slowly, methodically, aware that one misstep could ruin an entire batch. And ruin meant hunger not just for her family, but for the city that relied upon her craft. The streets were waking as she worked, the air filled with the first cries of children and the clatter of carts. Merchants and nobles alike came to her shop, purchasing candles in quantities unimaginable before the plague. Households that had once taken light for granted now bought dozens at a time, stacking them carefully in their homes, leaving them burning through the night to fend off shadows both real and imagined. The wealthy paid silver for scented candles, perfumed with rose or lavender, to mask the lingering smell of death. The poor purchased what they could afford, simple tallow sticks, unscented, but no less vital. Elspeth often found herself working late into the night, her hands stained with wax, her face lit by the soft glow of her own candles. Outside, the streets lay dark, save for the occasional flicker from a merchant's window or a priest carrying light from one church to another. Children peeked from alleyways, watching her, sometimes daring to touch the smooth, cooling wax. When she laid it out to harden, she allowed it, saying nothing, for the city had learned to crave warmth and light after long years of shadow. Yet the trade was not without peril. Candles burned hot, and one stray ember could destroy a shop, a home, or a neighborhood. Elspeth's father had learned this the hard way, and she carried the memory of his death with every careful motion. Beyond fire, there was still the threat of sickness, of disease lingering in the alleys, in the homes where candles were purchased and burned. Every flame was a defense against darkness, but no flame could ward off the fear that remained, hidden in every whispered cough, every twitching shadow. Her work also carried a quiet power. In homes where fear and grief had grown like weeds, a single candle could bring comfort, a sense of routine, a small proof that life continued. Clergy relied on her light to guide worshippers through shadowed churches. Families used her candles to mark meals, birthdays, and prayers. Even the orphans from St. Bride's choir carried candles back to their rooms at night, lighting them carefully so the darkness could not reach them. By the time Elspeth finally blew out her last wick for the night, the streets were silent again. The city lay under a blanket of fog and remembrance, every corner whispering the lessons of death and survival. Candles, she understood, were more than wax and flame. They were hope, memory, and resistance, flickering against a world that had once tried to burn everything away. And in the quiet glow that remained, the people of London learned something vital. Though the plague had ended, light like life must be made by the living, one careful hand at a time. They arrived quietly at first, slipping into the city's taverns and alleys like smoke from a forgotten hearth. Men and women who claimed to see beyond the fever, beyond the dying, beyond the shadow that had settled over London. They wore robes of strange colours, carried staffs carved with symbols no one recognized, and spoke in tongues that echoed faintly in the corners of rooms where merchants and labourers gathered. The city had survived the plague, but the plague had left an appetite for meaning, and the false prophets knew it. Father Edmund noticed them first. He had returned to his duties at St. Bride's, tending to the surviving congregation, teaching prayers to children who had grown up knowing loss better than lullabies. And now, in the shadows of his parish, men with long hair and sharper eyes whispered promises of protection, of insight, of salvation. The sickness will return, they warned, but I can shield you. Others claimed the fever had never truly left, that the city was haunted, and only their guidance could lead the living safely through the streets. At first, people listened. A widow who had buried her 3 sons sought out a man claiming to see spirits walking the lanes. A baker asked the prophet if he could keep his family from disease while tending the ovens. Even some priests felt unease, though they would not admit it aloud. The fear of a returning plague was a powerful lure, and the city's memory was long. The prophets were clever. They knew the language of loss. They spoke in parables about death and life, about sin and redemption, weaving the horrors of the past into their tales. The river remembers, one would say. The walls remember. The air itself carries the names of those taken. Only by my counsel can you walk unafraid. And people believed. They paid silver for amulets, for charms, for blessings that could not be tested, could not fail, and yet promised safety. But the city had its own rules, learned through fire and fever. Merchants watched for those who carried no goods, but claimed wealth in words. Mothers whispered to one another about who had paid too much for nothing. The orphans from St. Bride's sang of it in their choir, melodies sharp with caution, warning that not all who speak of salvation speak truth. False prophets gained power fast, filling the vacuum left by a city that had learned to fear and distrust. They built small followings in narrow lanes, their robes catching in the wind, their eyes bright with a hunger older than the plague. People came to them at night, asking questions they had long avoided. Why did the bell toll for neighbors no longer alive? Why did the fever return in subtle, untraceable ways? How could one survive when the city itself seemed to remember death at every turn? And the prophets answered always with a story, a promise, a warning. They never gave facts, never made guarantees, but people left their presence feeling reassured, if only for a short while. Some returned the next night, some returned with coins, some returned with a hunger to believe that the chaos had meaning, and that someone, somewhere, could control it. Father Edmund watched and wondered how many would be taken in, how many would follow blind faith into loss once more. He understood why. The city still ached from memory. Every shadow, every cough, every sudden gust of wind reminded them that death had come, had lingered, and might return. In that hunger for security, the false prophets found a foothold. And so, London learned yet another lesson. Even when survival returns, fear can breed new masters. Some wield swords, others silver, and some, like the prophets, only words. Yet all command the same thing, obedience. And the people, weary of loss, still listened. Spring had arrived again, though the warmth felt hesitant, as if the sun itself remembered the chill of the plague years. Gardens in London were reclaimed cautiously now, plots dug and fenced with care, every seedling pressed into the earth with hope and fear, intertwined. Yet in those small patches of green, the dead still lingered, not in shadow, not in spirit, but in bone, hidden just beneath the soil that was supposed to feed the living. Children discovered them first. Playing in the thawed dirt after a long winter, they dug with small hands, turning up fragments of what once had been bodies. Teeth blackened with age or disease, fragments of skull, shards of pottery or cloth, used to wrap the dead, tiny reminders of a time the city had hoped to forget. Mothers shrieked when they found their children leaning over the holes, and neighbors whispered prayers into the evening air, crossing themselves against the horror. Yet the children were unafraid. To them, these were not reminders of death, but curiosities, pieces of a history too near to be explained. Even the gardeners noticed. The soil in some yards seemed to resist cultivation, giving way only reluctantly to spade and hoe. Roots twisted around the shapes buried beneath, coiling over bone and ash as if the earth itself remembered the weight of the dead. The women who tended these gardens whispered about stubborn earth and cursed soil, but they kept planting anyway, because survival required it. Lettuce, carrots, herbs they pushed through the topsoil, fragile and green, nourished by a ground that had seen too much to forgive. Merchants and landlords were less patient. They sent inspectors to ensure the plots were productive, caring little for what lay beneath. A man caught a gardener lifting a piece of a skull to inspect it, and accused him of witchcraft. The gardener shrugged and muttered that the earth had always been full of bones. The city simply pretended otherwise. The accusation was dismissed, though gossip carried the story for weeks. In some of the wealthier homes, the bones became grim curiosities. They were placed in jars, catalogued, or pressed into plaster as ornaments for hearths and mantels. Scholars from across the city visited, paying to see the remnants of the plague, studying them with fascination and a detached awe that chilled the nurses and midwives who had once cleaned fevered beds. To these men and women, death was an artifact to be examined, not a memory to be honored. The smell lingered, faint and unyielding, a mixture of lime, wet clay, and the faint metallic tang of dried blood. It followed the gardener's home, seeped into the stone foundations of the houses, and crept along the streets when the wind was right. People learned to breathe around it, to live with it, but never to forget it. Some nights, when the fog rolled in thick from the Thames, the gardeners swore they could hear whispers in the earth, voices calling from below, soft and persistent, counting those who had gone before. Children claimed the bones moved slightly in the dark, rolling or shifting as though nudged by unseen hands. And perhaps they did. Perhaps the city itself remembered the plague in the very soil. By midsummer, the gardens had grown, the vegetables ready to harvest. Londoners ate of them cautiously, giving thanks, offering prayers, and sometimes muttering under their breath that the city had survived. And yet, beneath every sprig of parsley, beneath every carrot pulled from the earth, lay the quiet, stubborn truth. The dead were still here, feeding the living in silence, a constant reminder that life was always built upon what had come before. London's people learned to live with it. They tilled, they planted, they harvested, but the bones in the garden remained, patient, watching, unyielding, a silent chorus beneath the city that refused to forget. Winter returned early that year, sharp and bitter, driving Londoners indoors before the sun had fully risen. Smoke rose from every chimney, curling through the narrow streets like ghosts that refused to leave. It smelled of wood, of coal, and of despair, of lives rebuilt atop the ash of the dead. The city, still scarred by the plague, had learned to mask its stench with fire, but no amount of smoke could conceal the memory of what had passed, and the people carried it with them, as surely as they carried bread from market to home. The air was heavy with it. From the bakeries to the blacksmiths, from the candle makers to the apothecaries, smoke poured forth, painting the foggy mornings a dull orange. The city had learned to burn constantly, as if the rising plumes could chase away what remained hidden in alleys, under floorboards, beneath the stones themselves. The living had become pyromancers of memory, hoping that fire could replace the fear that still clung to London like a shadow. At the docks, merchants set fires in barrels to keep workers warm, their glow reflecting off the river and mingling with the mist. Sailors carried lanterns with tiny, smoky flames, balancing goods on their shoulders while the fog wrapped around their legs. Even the rats, who had once hidden from the living, now scurried through the haze, drawn to the warmth but careful to avoid the fire itself. The city's pulse had changed. It no longer moved in silence, but in waves of smoke that carried both survival and warning. Inside homes, the people followed suit. Families kept hearths burning day and night, small chimneys spitting grey curls into the air. The smoke became a sort of protection, a signal to the ghosts of the past that the living were still here, still breathing. Children huddled close to the fire, their eyes wide, learning early that light and warmth were shields against the darkness and the memories that clung to it. The lords of the city, too, relied on fire. Their manors and warehouses burned constantly, protecting not just property, but also power. Smoke became a tool, a weapon, even signaling control, signaling vigilance. Anyone wandering too close to a lord's holdings could smell it and understand without words. Trespass at your own peril. And so London learned another lesson, quietly. As always, survival depended not only on skill or luck, but on the ability to command even the air itself. Yet smoke carried a memory that fire could not erase. It reminded the living of the cremations, of the mass graves, of the ash that had once been their neighbors. It seeped into their lungs and made them cough, reminded them of how easily life could be stripped away. Some claimed they could smell faint traces of human sorrow within the curling tendrils, a lingering echo of grief they could not name. By midsummer, the smoke had become so constant that it shaped the rhythm of the city. It dictated when people could see, when children could play, when merchants could open their stalls. Even the wind seemed to carry it deliberately, funneling the haze into lanes and courtyards, as if the city itself was teaching its inhabitants that history was never truly gone. And so London lived under smoke, a city both alive and haunted. Every hearth, every chimney, every glowing ember became a reminder that though the plague had ended, the lessons it left behind, fear, memory, survival, would never fully leave. The living burned, not just for warmth, but to keep the past at bay, to remind themselves that the city, scarred though it was, could endure. In the year of smoke, London learned that survival required more than hands and heart. It required fire, constant and patient, rising like a sentinel above the streets, guarding against the shadows that refused to die. The countryside had always seemed eternal to Londoners, stretching out beyond the city walls in waves of green and gold, punctuated by the smoke of distant cottages. But after the plague, the fields themselves seemed fragile, as though they had aged alongside the people who tended them. Crops grew unevenly, soil rotted where it had been turned too quickly, and the smell of decay mingled with the sweet scent of new growth. The living had survived, but the earth itself had not. Farmers returned slowly, patching fences and repairing cottages. They carried tools in calloused hands, moved with the rhythm of necessity rather than hope. The land was generous, still, but it demanded work in a way it had never done before. Even a small mistake, a poorly turned furrow, a seed scattered too sparsely, could mean the difference between a handful of grain and empty bowls. And everywhere, the shadow of the dead lingered beneath the soil, reminding them that life could be both fleeting and relentless. In some fields, the plague had left an imprint so deep that nothing would grow. Where the fever had claimed entire villages, the earth lay fallow, unresponsive to toil or prayer. Cows grazed on thin grass, sheep wandered into hedgerows, and the soil smelled faintly of ash and lime, as if the past had seeped down to the roots. Farmers whispered to one another that some patches would never yield, that the earth remembered the dead and would not forgive the living. Those who survived carried the lessons of scarcity with them. They measured their sowing carefully, rationed their water, and kept a careful eye on the horizon for marauders, human or animal, ready to seize what little they had. The statute of laborers hung over them like a shadow, demanding obedience, even as the fields reminded them that obedience could no longer guarantee life. Families grew smaller, not by choice but by circumstance. Children were precious, because every mouth added weight to the struggle. Mothers bent over the earth, hands in dirt that had absorbed the last remnants of fever, teaching their children to plant and weed, to see the subtle shifts of seasons, to watch the sky for rain and wind. Every day was an act of endurance, every harvest a victory over both memory and mortality. Even the wealthy noticed the change. Landlords rode across their estates, noting which plots were productive and which had succumbed to rot. They demanded more from the tenants, threatening eviction for fields left untended, but their threats were met with quiet defiance. Men who had survived the plague knew their worth now. They had watched half their neighbors die, and had learned that labor alone could not guarantee survival, but stubbornness might. By midsummer, the fields were alive again, though unevenly so. Wheat bent in some places, barley sprouted in clumps, and gardens burst with herbs and vegetables wherever care and patience were applied. Yet beneath every root, every seed, there lingered a memory of loss. Farmers dug carefully, often pausing when their spades struck a fragment of bone, a charred piece of wood, or a patch of soil too dark with history to ignore. They worked in silence, aware that the living were merely tenants in a land still haunted by the dead. And at night, when the wind carried the faint tang of ash from the city, the farmers would close their cottages, look over the horizon, and wonder how long their labor could hold the past at bay. The plague had ended, yes, but it had left something more enduring than sickness, a lesson that the earth itself could be unforgiving, and that survival required constant vigilance, patience, and a respect for the shadow of all that had come before. By the time spring rolled over the Thames again, Londoners had learned that survival was not measured in days alone. It was measured in cunning, in observation, in knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. The plague had ended, but its lessons were etched into the bones and habits of the living, that mercy could be fleeting, that generosity could be exploited, and that every choice carried a cost deeper than a wound. Families adapted quickly. Mothers rationed what little food remained, measuring each bite for the strength of a child's limbs. Fathers labored from dawn to dusk in the fields, sweat running into eyes already bloodshot from worry. Hands blistered from tools that now felt heavier than ever. Even children were enlisted into this quiet struggle, carrying water, fetching firewood, sweeping hearths, learning to work not for pleasure, but for life itself. Every movement was a negotiation with scarcity, a contract with survival. The statute of laborers, imposed by a crown terrified of defiance, sought to govern this new world. The law commanded obedience, demanding that those who remained in service accept their old wages, return to the soil, and submit to authority once more. But it could not legislate courage, nor hope, nor the stubborn will of those who had seen death and chosen to live. Men slipped through the night, traveling to distant lands where labor was rewarded with silver rather than chains. Women hid small flocks of chickens in attics, planting herbs in barrels to evade landlords' notice. Each act, no matter how small, was a rebellion in miniature, a testament to the lengths the living would go to endure. In the markets, merchants grew shrewd. Bread and ale, grain and cloth, all were measured and priced with precision, rationed not only by supply, but by the buyer's desperation. People learned to barter, to read the expressions on the faces of traders and neighbors, to predict Who would hoard and who would sell? Knowledge became currency. Observation became a shield. A glance too long, a hesitation at a stall, could reveal a hidden stockpile, a vulnerability to exploit. The city's rhythm was now governed by the unspoken law of survival. Even the church, once a sanctuary, adapted to this new order. Priests collected tithes with renewed strictness, offering blessings in exchange for obedience, teaching the surviving children to pray with precision and discipline. The faithful, weary from loss and wary of the law, complied silently. Rituals became mechanical, yet they offered structure in a world that had lost so much. Faith, once a comfort, became another tool in the quiet negotiation of life. In the countryside, the law of survival was less formal, but no less exacting. Families who had fled the plague returned to till fields that had grown wild in their absence. Every seed planted, every furrow turned, was a gamble. Weather, pests, and exhaustion threatened at every step. They worked not for prosperity, but to stave off starvation, to reclaim some semblance of security. Each harvest was a victory over entropy, over memory, over the creeping despair that had followed the sickness. And so, life continued in a precarious balance. The plague had taught a brutal truth. The living were weaker than death, but cleverer. They bent to circumstance, reshaped their routines, and negotiated every breath, every morsel, every glance with vigilance. Survival was no longer simply breathing. It was anticipating the next challenge, evading the next injustice, and remembering always the cost of forgetting. In every street, every alley, every field, the city and the countryside alike whispered the same lesson. The dead had taught them well. The living had inherited the law of survival, one small, careful choice at a time, and in this law lay the fragile promise that London might endure once more. The roads leading out of London were lined with the restless and the hopeful. Pilgrims walked barefoot, carrying small sacks of food, rosaries, and beads of memory that weighed more heavily than their meager possessions. The plague had ended, yet the fear lingered, as though it had been baked into the cobblestones themselves. Every step on the pilgrim roads was an act of devotion, a negotiation with survival, and an acknowledgement of the fragility of life. Father Edmund observed them from the steps of St. Bride's, his eyes following the clusters of travellers who threaded their way through the mist. Some were headed to Canterbury, seeking absolution and miracles in the cathedral that had survived where so many homes had not. Others travelled to smaller shrines, sites of saintly memory and whispered hope. Few had the strength to walk unburdened by grief. Most carried the remnants of families lost, homes abandoned, or the ever-present fear that death might still lurk in the air. The pilgrims walked slowly, their feet cracking against frost-hardened earth. Children clutched mothers' skirts, eyes wide, drinking in the scents of wet straw, manure, and smoke from distant hearths. Some sang hymns softly to cover the sound of their trembling. Others muttered prayers under their breath, words tangled with ash and sorrow. Each voice joined the chorus of the road, a melody of endurance threaded through with desperation. Along the way, inns and hostels had begun to reopen, though they were crowded and wary. Travellers were inspected before being admitted, their clothes checked for signs of fever or filth. Food was rationed, beds shared. A coin could buy warmth, but it could not buy the memory of loss that accompanied each pilgrim. Innkeepers whispered among themselves, trading intelligence on those who travelled too lightly, who might carry news or sickness from distant villages. The roads had become arteries of both life and vigilance. Merchants followed the pilgrims, bringing wares and sustenance, knowing that need drives trade faster than hope ever could. Bread, cheese, small cloths, simple tools they sold with precision, gauging the traveller's desperation. Some pilgrims bartered, offering eggs, herbs, or labor in exchange for warmth or food. Others paid with silver, hoarding every piece for the long journey ahead. The economy of the road was a delicate balance, a mirror of the city's own struggle. Scarcity measured by necessity, morality weighed against survival. The road itself seemed to carry memory. A child stepping into a ditch would stumble upon bones just beneath the mud remnants of those who had traveled and fallen before. Families encountered hollowed graves at the roadside, marked by crude crosses or nothing at all, reminders that even pilgrimage offered no immunity from the lessons of death. Travelers would pause, say prayers, leave coins or a sprig of rosemary in the earth, and move on, as though motion itself could ward off memory. Some pilgrims spoke of visions along the way, ghosts of the dead walking beside them, shapes caught in the mist, the distant toll of bells that no longer rang. Father Edmund called these manifestations a mix of fear and grief, yet even he felt the pull of it when he walked the roads to minister to the traveling faithful. There was an undeniable presence along these paths, a quiet testament that the plague's shadow lingered even where the city could not reach. By the time the pilgrims reached Canterbury or smaller shrines in the countryside, their journey had changed them. Some carried relief in their hearts, a small taste of absolution. Others carried grief like a sack too heavy to lift. And through it all, the roads remained, stretching beyond horizon and memory, arteries connecting the living to both their past and the fragile hope of survival. The plague had ended, yes, but along the pilgrim roads, the lessons of its passage lived on. Each footstep was a prayer, each pause a remembrance, each breath a negotiation with mortality. The roads themselves whispered the truth. Survival requires movement, but memory never leaves the traveler behind. In the wake of the plague, London and the countryside beyond it began to dream. It was a quiet dreaming, tentative and fragile, whispered in the soft hiss of wind through chimney stacks, in the gentle stir of leaves along the riverbanks, in the low murmur of children at play among ruins. The people hoped, yet hoped cautiously, for the world had already taught them how swiftly fortune could turn. Father Edmund noticed it first in the prayers of the faithful. They no longer begged only for mercy or survival. Their voices carried a longing for restoration. "Make the city whole again," they said. "Let the streets smell of bread and not ashes. Let the children run without fear." The words were simple, yet heavy with centuries of grief. Even the orphans of St. Bride's whispered their hopes into the rafters, their voices trembling, tiny and untested. In the markets, merchants rebuilt their stalls with care. They washed away the grime of abandoned shops, repaired wheels and carts, and laid out goods with a precision that had been lost during the plague years. Bread, cheese, cloth, herbs, each item represented more than sustenance. It was a promise that life could continue, that the city could function once more as a living organism, rather than a hollowed husk. Patrons moved among them, careful yet eager, touching coins to wares and offering prayers of gratitude. Each exchange was a small renewal, a ritual of reclamation. Farmers sowed the fields again with the same cautious determination. Seed by seed, row by row, they coaxed life from earth that had endured droughts, floods, and the weight of unburied bodies. Each sprouting stalk was a reminder that the soil could still give, that life could still flourish atop memory. Families worked together in these fields, teaching children the patience of planting and the vigilance required to protect their harvest from pests, thieves, or misfortune. Renewal was not granted. It was earned through labor, foresight, and quiet courage. Even the craftsmen felt the stirring of revival. Carpenters and masons repaired homes and churches, reshaping structures that had fallen into decay. They replaced beams splintered by neglect, refitted windows broken by frost, and polished floors worn smooth by absence. Every nail, every stone, every splintered board restored was a quiet act of defiance against the memory of death. The city was healing in the only way it knew, slowly, meticulously, one hand at a time. Yet the dream of renewal was never free from caution. The plague had left its mark on the air, the earth, and the minds of the people. No one trusted too easily. Every smile was measured. Every touch was considered. Children were taught to wash hands, elders to inspect bread, merchants to count coins thrice before exchanging them. Renewal, they had learned, must coexist with vigilance. At night, when the fog rolled over the streets and the lamps flickered weakly against the mist, the city seemed to sigh. It was a quiet, trembling exhale, a mixture of hope and memory, of what had been lost and what could still be saved. People lit fires in their hearths, placed candles in windows, and whispered prayers into the darkness. Each light was a gesture of belief, a promise to continue, to rebuild, and to endure. By midsummer, the city hummed again, faint but unmistakable. Markets rang with muted voices, children laughed with cautious abandon, and the streets, though still carrying faint whispers of ash and memory, held the promise of growth. The dream of renewal was fragile, yet persistent, like a single green sprout breaking through a scarred and weary soil. London had survived the plague. Now, in the quiet determination of its people, it began to imagine itself whole again, and for the first time in years, hope felt almost tangible, as though the city itself exhaled, ready to breathe fully once more. They had never really left. London's rats were survivors of a kind that no human could fully understand. During the plague, they had multiplied unchecked, running along the edges of streets and alleys, slipping through doorways and sewer grates, thriving on the remains left behind. When the fever passed, people believed the vermin had dwindled, that the city had been cleansed of their presence along with the bodies they carried. But they were patient. They had learned to wait. The first signs were subtle. A shadow darted along a wall where none had been before. A scrape, a faint scurry, a flash of grey in the candlelight. Mothers shushed children, whispering tales of ghosts and warnings. Stay still. They watch. Merchants tightened nets over their grain. Bakers swept flour from thresholds twice a day, and landlords scolded tenants for leaving doors ajar. Yet the rats ignored nets, dodged sweepers, and slipped past locks with practiced ease. Thomas Bray, the city's most skilled rat catcher, had anticipated their return. He carried traps, poisoned grain, and lanterns, moving through the streets at dusk like a silent sentinel. He knew the habits of every pack, the tunnels they used to travel, the old buildings they favored for shelter. He had survived the plague, and he understood that the rats were more than vermin. They were living memory, embodiments of the city's endurance and its filth, reminders that survival could never erase what had come before. The rats adapted. They moved in coordinated patterns, striking markets just before dawn when the streets were quiet, scattering coins and goods in the process. They nested in attics above bakeries, gnawed at doorframes, and carried away scraps that the living thought they had secured. People tried to outwit them with traps and poisons, but the creatures learned quickly, testing and avoiding, disappearing as silently as they arrived. It was a war waged in shadow, fought in the quiet moments between the city's rush and its rest. Children were the first to notice. They laughed and pointed at the small intruders, chasing them with sticks and buckets. Their laughter echoed across empty courtyards and alleyways, but the adults watched silently, recognizing in the movement a truth they had long ignored. The city was alive not just with the living, but with creatures that had seen the worst and survived. Merchants cursed quietly when they discovered grains gone from barrels, coins gnawed or lost, and goods spoiled from moisture carried by tiny feet. Bakers covered bread in tight nets, only to find them torn in the morning. Even priests murmured prayers to stave off pestilence, muttering that God might see the rats as instruments of warning, reminders that the past remained intertwined with the present. By winter, the rats had become a constant presence, threading through the streets with a familiarity that made humans uneasy. They slipped beneath doors, over walls, and through sewers, multiplying faster than traps could contain. Their survival was a quiet defiance, a reflection of the tenacity that had allowed London itself to endure. And yet, there was something more. Thomas Bray had begun to whisper that the rats were teaching the city a lesson. They reminded the living of scarcity, of resourcefulness, and of caution. They were the plague's shadow walking in fur, the pulse of survival made tangible, swift, and unavoidable. Londoners learned to coexist. Nets became thicker, traps more cunning, and poison carefully measured. Families protected their hearths and pantries, the children watched, and the merchants counted their goods twice. The city, scarred and wary, understood at last that the rats had returned not to punish, but to remind. The plague had ended, yes, but the lessons of survival, the cunning, the vigilance, the patience were eternal. And so the rats ran through the alleys and under the floorboards, as they always had, as they always would, carrying with them the ghost of what had been, and the constant promise of what must still be survived. The tension had been building quietly for years, like smoke curling beneath a door, barely noticed until it was too late to ignore. The plague had thinned the population, leaving fields untended and cities half empty. The survivors had grown stronger, more aware of their value, and more defiant. Wages were demanded, liberties exercised, and laws like the Statute of Labourers were openly flouted. The lords had tried to tighten their grip, but the more they pressed, the more the living resisted. The stage was set for upheaval. It began in Kent, a small spark in the southeastern fields. A group of labourers, denied proper wages for work done during the harvest, refused to leave the lord's lands when the overseer called them back. They argued quietly at first, then shouted, then grabbed tools from the sheds. By nightfall, they had torches, pitchforks, and the first taste of defiance. Word spread quickly along the roads and lanes, reaching neighbouring villages that had suffered similar abuses. Londoners watched with mixed awe and fear as the revolt spread. Merchants shuttered shops in case mobs passed through, carrying fire and fury like a contagion. Nobles gathered their retainers, arming themselves and preparing for skirmishes in the countryside. Soldiers rode from one village to another, only to find that the fields were empty. Peasants had fled to join the uprising, their families in tow, carrying pitch and scythes instead of tools for the harvest. At night, the villages became a chorus of whispers, fires burning in the long-abandoned barns. The rebels moved quietly, taking what they needed from the estates and redistributing it among themselves. Bread, grain, tools, and livestock changed hands quickly. In the shadow of threat and the gleam of opportunity, what had once been law, written in ink and enforced with whips, was now laughed at in hidden corners. People realized that survival was no longer about obedience but about courage and cunning. The revolt spread like wildfire through the Midlands. Farmers who had once knelt in fields now marched toward manors, demanding recognition of labour, fair pay, and the right to govern their own work. The lords, accustomed to unquestioned authority, were caught off guard. Some attempted negotiation, offering minor concessions, only to see the anger of the living swell higher. Others raised armies, but even trained soldiers struggled against men and women who knew every path, every hedge, every hidden entrance. In London, the city watched cautiously. Rumours arrived of burned barns, toppled fences, and nobles fleeing with their silver and grain. The people of the city had learned to fear the countryside, but also to admire the audacity of those who would challenge centuries of oppression. Children listened from alleyways as fathers whispered tales of the revolt, their voices trembling not from fear, but from hope that change might be possible. Even the clergy were divided. Some preached obedience and reminded the people of God's law, while others quietly sympathized, offering blessings to those who marched and whispered prayers for success. The church, like the city, understood that life had changed, that the living would not bend so easily again. By midsummer, the peasants' revolt had transformed from isolated skirmishes into a movement, a wave of defiance that threatened to reshape the relationship between the land and those who worked it. The lords, the soldiers, the merchants, none could ignore it. Londoners watched the smoke rising from distant villages, knowing that the echoes of the plague had not ended with death. Survival had taught the living how to demand more. and this time they were determined to take it. The revolt was not only about bread or wages, it was about memory, about dignity, about the lesson that the plague had taught all who remained, that life, once reclaimed, would not be surrendered quietly again. The night was heavy with smoke, the kind that clung to every roof beam, every shutter, every stone like a second skin. Villages smouldered in the distance, the aftermath of the peasants' revolt leaving skeletal remains of barns, manors, and fences. Flames had licked through the countryside, consuming what the living had built on soil that had already been baptized in death. And in the silence that followed, the city and the fields alike seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would rise from the ashes. London watched cautiously. From the riverbanks, the glow of distant fire painted the fog in dull orange hues. Merchants and bakers shuttered their doors, counting coin in fearful hands, aware that disorder in the countryside could spill into the city at any moment. The smoke carried the scent of charred timber, melted pitch, and a faint, persistent reminder of the plague. Ash was a familiar companion, not a new threat. It whispered of mortality, survival, and the fragile line between them. Those who had taken part in the revolt had vanished into the night, returning to the villages they had torched or disappearing into the forests beyond. Fires had been both shield and statement, warning to the lords, proof to neighbors that resistance was possible, and a way to cleanse the old order in a blaze bright enough to mark the night sky. Yet the silence that followed was deeper than smoke could measure. Streets that had once been alive with labor, laughter, and barter now seemed to pause, as if the city itself were mourning the destruction that had come in the name of survival. In the villages, survivors wandered among the ruins, counting losses beyond the tally of coin or livestock. Homes were reduced to charred beams and broken tiles. Fences lay in blackened splinters across the mud. Some farmers knelt in the ash, pressing hands into soil scorched by both fire and plague, searching for seeds that had survived. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed and silent, learning early that rebellion carried consequences beyond the immediate. The air was filled with smoke, but it was the weight of absence that pressed hardest against their lungs. Even in the manors, the wealthy learned the cost of defiance. Their barns burned, grain spoiled by smoke, livestock scattered. Guards patrolled with renewed vigilance, yet their swords were no defense against a population that had tasted autonomy. Letters were sent to London, pleading for mercenaries, for justice, for law to be restored. But law was fragile, and the lessons of survival had made the living wary. No decree could undo what they had learned. Fear alone could not guarantee obedience. By dawn, the fires had mostly died. Smoke hung low, curling around chimneys and between rooftops, blending with the fog that had become the city's constant companion. Streets were empty, save for the occasional scavenger, the child searching for food, the farmer salvaging what he could. And in that quiet, the city seemed to listen to itself, remembering the flames and the fire's lesson, that destruction could be both punishment and liberation, and that silence after devastation was the most eloquent teacher. Father Edmund walked through the streets of London that morning, his robes heavy with ash, his eyes scanning rooftops and alleys alike. He noted the burned barrels of merchants, the scorched shutters, the faint smell of smoke in every corner. London had survived fire before, just as it had survived plague. Yet in the quiet that followed, he realized that survival carried memory with it. The city's heartbeat slowed in that morning haze, echoing the tremor of both loss and defiance. In the silence after fire, London remembered. It remembered the revolt, the ashes, the courage, and the warnings that fire always leaves behind. The city inhaled, tentative and wary, and waited for the living to return, not as victims, not as witnesses, but as people who had endured, learned, and would carry the lessons forward into every street, every field, and every home that had survived the night. Even when the fires had died and the streets began to hum with life once more, London carried a weight that no rebuilding could lift. It was not in the stones or the timber alone, though they bore the scars of ash and flame. It was in the air itself, in the smell of lime, soot, and charred earth that clung to walls and streets, in the cautious steps of children who had learned too early that survival demanded vigilance. It was the weight of memory, the knowledge that the city had been unmade once and could be unmade again. Father Edmund noticed it in the people who returned to church. They knelt for prayer, their heads bowed, but their eyes flicked toward the doors, the windows, even the shadows, as if expecting calamity to follow them inside. Children whispered to one another about what they had seen in the streets, the ashes, the burned barns, the charred remnants of carts that once carried the dead. Mothers spoke in low tones of neighbors who had vanished without trace. Even the clergy, tempered by years of tending the living and burying the dead, felt it. The weight of memory did not discriminate. In the homes of the wealthy, the scars of revolt and plague lingered quietly. Furniture repaired, floors swept, windows replaced, yet the echoes of the past were there in the boards that groaned underfoot, in the faint smell of ash that returned with the rain, in the silverware that had been hastily hidden during upheaval. Even coin seemed heavier, tainted by the knowledge of who had earned it and who had been denied. Every transaction carried more than value. It carried history. The streets were no different. Merchants shouted their wares, children ran past shouting, and workmen hammered on new constructions. But every corner, every alley, every shadow reminded Londoners of what they had lost. The plague had taught them fear, the fires had taught them defiance, and the rebellion had taught them endurance. And all of it lingered like a low hum, a constant reminder that survival alone was not enough. Memory demanded acknowledgement. Even the earth beneath the city remembered. Foundations shifted slightly where unmarked graves lay below, floorboards creaked above long-forgotten pits, and in some alleys, a stray stone might bear the weight of a name no one would speak aloud. Gardeners who planted new crops often paused when their spades struck something unusual, bits of bone, fragments of tile, charred debris, and for a moment they remembered that every harvest was built atop loss. Londoners began to move with care. Touch was measured, voices were hushed, and even laughter carried restraint. People spoke in codes, gestures, and whispers, training themselves to navigate not just the streets, but the memories they carried within them. The plague had ended, the fires had burned themselves out, yet memory was eternal. It shaped behavior, guided decisions, and lingered in the very marrow of the living. By the time summer returned, the city had adapted to its burden. Life resumed, but it carried the quiet weight of remembrance. Trades flourished, markets thrived, and children played in the sunlight, but always with a shadow at their back, always aware that the city had been broken once before, and that the lessons of loss were inscribed in every brick and cobble. The weight of memory was not punishment, nor was it sorrow alone. It was a teacher, relentless yet impartial, reminding the living of what they had endured, what they had rebuilt, and what they must never forget. London walked forward slowly, carefully, beneath the gaze of its own history, carrying each scar like a lesson pressed into its bones. And as the city exhaled in the warmth of a rare afternoon, the people understood that life, though recovered, would always bear the quiet vigilance of remembrance. The plague was gone, but memory, their most constant companion, remained. The countryside had begun to stir again, not with the slow, predictable rhythm of seasons alone, but with the pulse of those who had survived. Villages were rebuilt, fields replanted, and homes repaired. Yet beneath every foundation lay the memory of absence, the bones, the ashes, the remnants of lives snatched too early. England, scarred and cautious, had learned that renewal required more than labor. It demanded vigilance, patience, and the quiet persistence of those who refused to forget. Small communities had grown resilient in the plague's aftermath. Farmers worked the soil with careful hands, sowing seeds in straight rows, measuring each plot with the memory of famine and fear. They learned to rotate crops and guard against pests, not merely to feed themselves, but to preserve what remained from the devastation. Livestock that had survived the fever were tended with meticulous care, each animal a living testament to the endurance of the living. Even the children were pressed into service, learning early to distinguish weeds from crops, to count animals, to carry water and firewood. Survival, they understood instinctively, demanded attention in every detail. Trade revived alongside the fields. Markets reopened, and towns buzzed with cautious commerce. Bakers, merchants, and craftsmen, some of them orphans who had grown into their work, brought the city alive again. The wealthier townsfolk traded coins for goods, while the poor bartered vegetables, eggs, and handmade cloth. Knowledge became currency. The ability to discern value, anticipate need, and navigate scarcity proved as vital as skill with the plough or hammer. The plague had ended, but its lessons lingered in every transaction. Yet for all the rebirth, tension remained. Landlords enforced old laws with renewed vigor, demanding wages, rents, and loyalty, often threatening exile or worse for defiance. Peasants, emboldened by the knowledge that survival was now their leverage, pushed back subtly, working only when it suited them, leaving fields untended if the price was unfair, traveling under cover of night to seek better opportunities elsewhere. The statute of laborers still hung over them like a shadow, but it was no longer absolute. The living had learned that fear alone could not dictate obedience. Even the clergy adjusted to the New England. Churches reopened, but worship was tempered by pragmatism. Priests taught discipline and prayer, yet they understood that the faithful had seen death up close and would not be cowed by mere words. They spoke of endurance, morality, and vigilance rather than miracles, guiding a population shaped by memory and loss. The sermons reminded congregations that survival was not only physical but spiritual, a careful balance between remembrance and renewal. In the cities and villages alike, the environment itself had changed. The rivers that had carried bodies now carried commerce. Roads that had been empty became lifelines for trade and travel. Even the forests bore witness to new settlements, where felled trees supplied lumber for houses and fences, and where the wildlife, once dominant in abandoned fields, now coexisted uneasily with humans returning to claim the land. The natural world, like the people, adapted to the New England. By midsummer, the land bore life again. Crops flourished, towns thrummed with commerce, and the rhythm of daily labor returned. Yet, beneath every field, in every home, and along every street, the memory of the plague persisted. The people had learned to live in its shadow, to respect its lessons, and to build their lives atop its remnants. England had survived death, fire, rebellion, and loss. What emerged was a country tempered by history, cautious but enduring. The New England was not naive, not hopeful in ignorance. It was pragmatic, wary, and resilient. It was a land shaped by the weight of memory, rebuilt by the hands of the living, and prepared, however silently, to endure whatever came next. Even as summer waned and autumn crept across the countryside, London and the surrounding villages remained alive with movement, trade, and labor. Yet for all the rebuilding, all the sowing and harvesting, all the careful tending of hearths and homes, the city carried a weight that would never fully lift. The plague had ended, yes, but the night it left behind lingered, a shadow that stretched across generations, threading through every street, alley, and field. It was the night that never ends. At dusk, the streets grew quiet first, as they always had. Candlelight flickered behind windows, throwing long, tremulous shadows across cobblestones still scarred by fire and neglect. Children returned from fields and schools, their laughter softer, their play cautious, as if the memory of absence still pressed against their bones. Mothers whispered warnings they could not explain, and fathers watched, hands resting uneasily on tools or sticks, aware that survival had not erased fear. The darkness carried a weight, a pulse of memory, of what had been lost and what might return. The air was heavy with smoke, still curling from hearths, chimneys, and taverns. It smelled of wax, coal, and ash, a familiar scent that reminded the living of both warmth and mortality. Candlemakers, bakers, and apothecaries worked late, their flames illuminating faces lined with exhaustion, determination, and the faint shadow of grief. Every light, every labor, every careful action was a defiance against the lingering night, a small act of resistance that carried the memory of those who had not survived. The rat-catchers moved among the alleys, as if patrolling the boundary between light and shadow. Rats scuttled beneath floorboards, over rooftops, and through the sewers, reminders that the city's history, like its pestilence, had not been fully erased. Children peered from windows or doorways, watching the shadows move, learning again that survival required vigilance in ways adults often took for granted. The night itself had a pulse, and the city listened carefully, for the lessons of memory were sharper than the lessons of fear. Out in the countryside, the plague's shadow was subtler but no less present. Fields, though green, were carefully tended. Farmers measured every seed, watched every soil shift, and carried with them the memory of famine, sickness, and the abandonment of neighbors. The wind carried whispers from burned barns, from villages abandoned in defiance, from graves still unmarked. It reminded them that the night was patient, and it waited for mistakes. Even the clergy, hardened by years of tending the living and burying the dead, felt the night. They walked through churches that smelled faintly of lime and incense, observing the faithful with eyes trained by experience. Prayer had changed. It was no longer only for forgiveness or salvation, but for endurance, for guidance, for the strength to face the memory that never left. The night never ends, and in its darkness, humans had to learn to carry both hope and fear. By candlelight and hearth, people whispered stories to one another of loss, of defiance, of survival. Children learned to navigate alleys by memory, to read the signs of danger and opportunity, to understand that the living were always heirs to the dead. Families preserved what they could, sharing knowledge, tools, and food with a careful hand. The lessons of the plague, the fires, the revolt, and the return of life were never forgotten. They were inscribed in every step, every heartbeat, every breath. And so London breathed again, slowly and cautiously, alive but never naive. The city knew that survival carried memory as surely as the night carried shadow. The plague had ended, yes, but the night never truly did. It remained in the fog, the ash, the floorboards, the river, and the streets themselves, a constant companion to the living, whispering lessons of endurance, vigilance, and remembrance. The people of England had rebuilt, traded, planted, and prayed. They had survived, but they had also learned the truth that would never leave them. Life carries its ghosts, and the night never ends.